My name is Charmaine. I am 35 years old and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity but maintained occasional contact. Last Sunday, they invited me to an upscale brunch to catch up. Between mimosas and avocado toast, my mother leaned forward smirking. You know, Charmaine, you are lucky we even include you. Pity goes a long way. I simply sipped my coffee and smiled. That night, I logged in disabled every family credit account and emailed my lawyer about selling the cabin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Fairfield, Connecticut meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling colonial home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our four-bedroom house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom, painted pale blue, at my mother Elaine's insistence, despite my preference for green, became my sanctuary and my prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A grades, joined honor societies, and desperately tried to buy their love with my achievements. Every report card, every coding award, every promotion at my tech firm was met with indifferent nods from my parents. But none of that prepared me for the ultimate betrayal by the man I married. I thought marrying Jamal would be my permanent escape. When we first met at a tech convention in Atlanta, he swept me off my feet with his southern charm and big promises. He told me we would build a real family, something I had craved my entire life. I moved my entire life down south for him. I poured my savings into his dreams. Fast forward to today, sitting inside a high-end Atlanta law firm. The heavy oak doors of the conference room closed behind me with a sickening thud. The room smelled of expensive leather-stale coffee and overwhelming arrogance. Across the polished mahogany table sat Jamal, my husband of 8 years. He used to be charming, a man who promised to protect me from the coldness of my past. Now he wore a custom-tailored suit that he had purchased using my credit card. He leaned back in his plush leather chair with a smug expression that made my stomach churn. Without a word, he reached into his designer jacket, pulled out a sleek silver pen, and scribbled something on his checkbook. With a flick of his wrist, he slid a crisp check across the smooth surface of the table. It stopped right in front of my hands. I looked down. $5,000. I stared at the numbers, letting the heavy silence fill the room. Jamal let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Take it, Charmaine," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Consider it your severance pay for 8 years of marriage. You can use it to rent a little apartment somewhere far away from me." My lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I did not blink. I did not cry. I just kept staring at the man who had promised to love and protect me. Beside Jamal sat Chloe. She was 26 years old, an aspiring social media influencer, and the sole reason my marriage was ending in this cold, sterile room. She wore a tight designer dress that screamed for attention, completely inappropriate for a legal setting. Chloe was busy applying a thick layer of shimmering lip gloss, using her front-facing phone camera as a mirror. She rolled her eyes loudly, complaining about how the law office smelled like old paper and depression. She whined to Jamal that they were going to be late for their dinner reservation at a trendy new steakhouse downtown. She did not even bother to look at me. To her, I was just a minor inconvenience standing in the way of her new glamorous life. She was already busy planning how to redecorate the house I had picked out, scrolling through expensive furniture catalogs on her phone while my lawyer reviewed the documents. It was sickening to watch. Jamal patted her knee affectionately before turning his cold gaze back to me. He laid out his demands like a king dividing his conquered territory. He was keeping the $800,000 house we had lived in. He was keeping total control of the luxury car rental business. It was a business I had secretly helped him build from the ground up. I had written the code for his entire booking system and quietly paid the down payments for his first fleet of cars, using my tech salary, while he took all the public credit. And most agonizing of all, he was demanding primary custody of our 8-year-old daughter Zuri. He knew I had the financial means to fight him in court. I could have dragged this divorce out for years. I could have frozen his business accounts and fought tooth and nail for every single asset we acquired during our marriage. I was a successful software developer who could afford the best legal representation in Atlanta. But what he did not know was that I had a completely different strategy in mind. When my lawyer finally spoke up to contest the division of assets, I held up my hand to stop him. I looked Jamal dead in the eye and told him I did not want the house. I did not want his cars. I did not even want alimony. The confusion on his face was immediate. His arrogant smirk faltered for just a second. His lawyer looked entirely baffled by my statement. But then I dropped the one condition that made Jamal's jaw hit the floor. I told him I wanted his mother, Ms. Evelyn. She had always been the mother to me that Elaine never was. When I first moved to Atlanta, Evelyn welcomed me with open arms, cooking Sunday dinners and teaching me what real family warmth felt like. I stated clearly that if I was walking away today, his disabled elderly mother was coming with me. Jamal stared at me in absolute disbelief. His mother had suffered a minor stroke 2 years ago and required a wheelchair and a steady routine. To Jamal, the woman who gave birth to him had become nothing more than a financial drain and a massive social embarrassment. He constantly complained about her medical bills and hated how her wheelchair scuffed the hardwood floors. He hated how her presence ruined the modern, flawless aesthetic of his home when his fraternity brothers came over to watch football. Chloe actually laughed out loud when I made my demand. She leaned over to whisper something in his ear, pointing at the older woman sitting quietly in the corner of the room. Jamal shook his head, a wide, greedy smile spreading across his face. "You want the old lady?" he asked, as if I had just offered to take out the household trash for him. "Fine. Take her." He pointed at the $5,000 check resting on the table. "Like I said, consider this your payment for taking my 2 biggest headaches off my hands. You take my mother and I get my life back. Deal." He snatched the final divorce papers from his lawyer and signed them right then and there. He was practically vibrating with excitement. He truly believed he had won the ultimate victory. He believed he had stripped me of my dignity, my beautiful home, and my only child, all while discarding the mother he despised. I calmly picked up the check, folded it precisely in half, and slipped it into my purse. I stood up from the mahogany table and adjusted my blazer. I walked over to the corner of the room where my sweet 8-year-old daughter Zuri was sitting quietly on a leather sofa. My heart ached at the sight of her swinging her legs, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. I knelt down to her eye level, pulled her into a tight, warm hug, and whispered a secret promise into her ear. I told her to remember the plan we practiced. A promise and a mission only she and I understood. Zuri was a smart girl, brilliant like me, and she knew exactly how to handle the situation she was being temporarily left in. Zuri looked at me with her big brown eyes and gave me a tiny, brave nod. She knew this arrangement was only temporary. I kissed her forehead, breathing in the scent of her vanilla shampoo one last time before standing up. Then I walked over to Ms. Evelyn, whose frail hands were trembling in her lap. She looked up at me with tears welling in her eyes, silently apologizing for her son's horrific behavior. She whispered a soft apology, her voice raspy and filled with shame. I placed my hand gently over hers. "Do not apologize, Mama," I whispered back. "We are going home." "Going?" I smiled warmly at her and unlocked the brakes on her wheelchair. Chloe let out a dramatic sigh of relief, loud enough for the whole room to hear. She was visibly thrilled that the large master bedroom and the expensive house would finally be hers alone without an old woman to ruin her aesthetic videos. Jamal gave me one last victorious smirk, adjusting his expensive tie. But as I pushed Ms. Evelyn toward the heavy oak doors, I let a genuine smile touch my own lips. They thought I was walking away with nothing but a worthless check and a heavy burden. They thought they had broken me. They had absolutely no idea about the massive secret Ms. Evelyn and I shared. They had no idea that by carelessly throwing his own mother away, Jamal had just handed me the key to a $20 million real estate empire hidden right in the heart of Atlanta. They did not know that the dusty, abandoned warehouse district she owned was about to become the most valuable property in the state, and my carefully calculated revenge had only just begun. I pushed the wheelchair out into the brightly lit hallway, leaving my toxic past behind me in that conference room, ready to claim the future I truly deserved. Stepping out of the towering glass building, the humid Atlanta air hit my face, but I had never felt more refreshed. Jamal had already sent a mocking text message to my phone recommending a cheap bed-bug-infested motel out by the interstate. He genuinely believed that without his supposed financial support, I would be destitute. For the entirety of our marriage, I let him believe that I was just a mid-level database manager and a low-level hospital cleaner scraping by to help pay his bills. I never corrected him when he bragged to his fraternity brothers that he was the sole provider of our household. What Jamal did not know, what I kept meticulously hidden behind shell corporations and heavy non-disclosure agreements, was that my software development skills had birthed a multi-million-dollar medical logistics company. I exclusively controlled the supply chain software for 30 major hospitals across the Southeast. My private driver, Marcus, pulled up to the curb in a sleek black SUV. He quickly stepped out to help me load Ms. Evelyn and her battered vintage suitcase into the vehicle. As we drove away from the law firm, Evelyn looked out the tinted window, her frail hands gripping her purse tightly. She asked me in a quiet, trembling voice if we were going to a city shelter. I gently patted her knee and told her to trust me. The drive was short but deeply satisfying. I watched the urban landscape shift from the sterile corporate blocks downtown to the lush, tree-lined avenues of Buckhead. We bypassed the cramped, cheap apartments Jamal assumed I would rent, and instead headed straight into the heart of the wealthiest district in Atlanta. The SUV glided past luxury boutiques, upscale art galleries, and five-star restaurants before pulling into the secure, gated underground garage of an exclusive high-rise building. The security guard nodded respectfully as we passed a stark contrast to the dismissive glares of Jamal's lawyer. I wheeled Ms. Evelyn into the private gold-trimmed elevator. I scanned my biometric thumbprint and the doors silently closed. When the elevator chimed and opened directly into my penthouse, Evelyn gasped loudly. The space was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Sunlight poured over the pristine hardwood floors, the imported marble kitchen island, and the custom velvet furniture I had carefully selected months ago. This was not the home of a struggling hospital cleaner. This was the fortress of a woman who had silently built an empire while her husband was busy playing pretend. Evelyn stared at the crystal chandelier hanging above the dining table and then looked at me completely speechless. I smiled, parked her wheelchair near the plush sofa, and told her welcome home. Once Evelyn was comfortable and handed a warm cup of herbal tea, I carried her battered leather suitcase into the spacious guest suite I had specifically designed for her. The room had wide doors for her wheelchair, a custom accessible bathroom, and a beautiful view of the city parks. I laid the heavy suitcase on the bed and popped the rusted brass latches. As I began to unpack her modest belongings, mostly faded floral dresses and old photo albums, I heard the soft hum of her motorized wheelchair approaching the doorway. I turned around to see thick tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. She was crying so hard her frail shoulders shook. I immediately dropped the clothes and rushed over to her, kneeling on the soft rug. I asked her what was wrong, terrified she was in physical pain. She shook her head, burying her face in her hands. She told me she was so sorry for the absolute cruelty of her son. She sobbed, confessing that she felt like a massive burden, a piece of garbage that Jamal had tossed away for $5,000. She said she never wanted to ruin my life or drag me down with her medical issues, now that I was entirely on my own. I took her trembling hands in mine and looked directly into her eyes. I told her she was never a burden. I reminded her that when my own mother Elaine treated me like a disappointment back in Connecticut, she was the one who taught me how to make peach cobbler, who braided Zuri's hair with patience, and who sat up with me when I was sick. Then Evelyn looked away, the shame deepening the lines on her face. Her voice broke as she revealed a dark truth that made my blood boil. She confessed that for the past 2 years, Jamal had been systematically stealing her Social Security checks. Every single month, he intercepted the mail and forged her signature. He told her the money was going toward her expensive physical therapy and her heart medication. But Evelyn was not foolish. She had seen the bank statements he carelessly left on the kitchen counter. She knew he was funneling her meager survival funds directly into Chloe's designer handbag collection, expensive hair extensions, and luxury vacations. He had been starving his own disabled mother to fund his affair with a 26-year-old influencer. Evelyn cried that she had absolutely nothing left to her name, that she was entirely penniless, and she could not bear the thought of being a financial drain on me. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage toward Jamal, but I kept my voice perfectly calm for Evelyn. I stood up from the floor and wiped the tears from her face. I told her she was not penniless. I told her that Jamal was an arrogant fool who only saw what was right in front of his greedy eyes. Evelyn looked confused as I walked back over to her open suitcase on the guest bed. "I did not just bring you here because I love you, Mama," I said, reaching into the suitcase. "I brought you here because it is time to take back everything he stole from you." Evelyn watched closely as I ran my fingers along the bottom of the old suitcase. She had packed it herself years ago, but she seemed to have forgotten its deepest secret. I pressed my thumbs into the corners of the worn fabric lining, found the concealed zipper I had discovered by accident when helping her pack during a hospital visit months prior, and pulled it back. Evelyn gasped sharply, her hand flying to her mouth. She had hidden something in there decades ago, long before Jamal's father passed away, and she had assumed it was completely lost to time and foreclosure. From the hidden compartment, I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. The paper was yellowed and stiff with age. I walked over and gently placed it in her lap. Evelyn's hands shook violently as she broke the old wax seal and pulled out the crisp, heavy legal documents inside. It was the original deed to a massive commercial warehouse block located right in the heart of the historic Sweet Auburn district. Jamal knew about the property, of course. Years ago, he had scoffed at it, calling it a dilapidated pile of bricks in a dead neighborhood. When the property taxes piled up after Evelyn's stroke, Jamal told her he let the city foreclose on it. He told her it was worthless and not worth his time to manage. He used it as another excuse to call her a financial failure and strip away her independence. What Jamal did not know, and what I had kept absolutely secret, was that the city never foreclosed on it. 2 years ago, when I first saw the delinquency notices, I quietly hired a private attorney. I used the profits from my logistics company to pay off every single cent of the back taxes. I settled the liens. I brought the property code compliance up to date. I secured the perimeter. I did it all anonymously through a blind trust so Jamal would never find out. The property was free, clear, and fully legally owned by the woman sitting in front of me. Evelyn stared at the deed, tracing the raised ink of her name with her thumb. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, awe, and a newly ignited fire. She asked me how I managed to save it, how I had the money. I finally told her the truth about my business. I explained how I built my company in the quiet hours of the night while Jamal was out drinking, how I secured federal contracts, and how I made sure he never had access to my primary accounts. I told her that she was standing on a gold mine. The Sweet Auburn district was currently the target of the largest urban revitalization project in the history of Atlanta. Developers were aggressively buying up every square inch of land, and her warehouse block was sitting dead center in their crosshairs. I had already received preliminary inquiries from major urban development firms offering astronomical sums. They were desperate to acquire the land to build a massive tech hub and luxury shopping center. Jamal threw away a winning lottery ticket because he was too arrogant and impatient to look past the dirt. Evelyn sat silently for a long moment. The fragile weeping woman from 10 minutes ago vanished. In her place sat the resilient matriarch who had survived a lifetime of hardship. A fierce determination hardened her features. She looked down at the deed, then looked at me with absolute clarity. She wheeled herself over to the small writing desk in the corner of the guest suite. She opened the top drawer, pulled out a black ink pen, and clicked it with a sharp, decisive snap. She flipped the deed over to the transfer section. Without a single second of hesitation, she began filling out the legal fields. I stepped forward, surprised by her sudden momentum, and told her she did not have to do that. I told her it was her property, her future security. But Evelyn did not stop writing. Her handwriting, usually shaky from her stroke, was incredibly firm and deliberate. She signed her name at the bottom of the page with a heavy stroke of black ink. She turned the document around and slid it across the desk toward me. She looked up, her eyes blazing with a cold, calculated justice. She declared that Jamal had traded her for $5,000. She stated that he had sold his own flesh and blood for the price of a cheap vacation. She pointed to the signature line where she had just legally transferred 100% ownership of the multi-million-dollar property directly into my name. Evelyn leaned back in her wheelchair, a slight, dangerous smile playing on her lips. She told me the property was mine now, completely and entirely. She said Jamal wanted to play a ruthless game of money and power, and it was time we showed him exactly how that game was played. She instructed me to take the deed to sell the land, and to use every single penny of it to destroy the false empire her son had built on my back. I picked up the heavy document, the weight of a $20 million revenge plan settling perfectly into my hands. 2 days passed since that moment of triumph in the penthouse when the deed fell perfectly into my hands. Ms. Evelyn was finally resting peacefully in her custom-designed suite. I had immediately hired an elite private round-the-clock nursing team to tend to her medical needs, ensuring she received the highest standard of care without ever having to worry about the crushing cost. Knowing she was safe and comfortable, I needed a moment to review some newly acquired supply chain contracts for my logistics company. I took my private elevator down to the artisan coffee shop located on the ground floor of my luxury residential building. The cafe was a beautifully designed, serene space filled with the rich aroma of freshly roasted espresso beans and the quiet hum of wealthy patrons conducting their morning business. I sat at a corner marble table dressed casually but sharply in a tailored silk blouse, sipping an iced matcha latte while scrolling through the financial spreadsheets on my tablet. I was completely focused on my work, calculating the profit margins for a new hospital delivery route, until a harsh, shrill voice completely shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the room. "Well, look who we finally tracked down." The voice belonged to Tasha Jamal's younger sister, and the undisputed golden child of their deeply toxic family. I slowly locked my tablet screen and looked up. Tasha was standing right in front of my table, her hands planted firmly on her hips in an aggressive stance. She was wearing a brightly patterned skin-tight jumpsuit adorned with massive, gaudy designer logos that I instantly recognized as cheap counterfeit items. The stitching on her handbag was completely uneven, a perfect physical representation of her entirely fake lifestyle. Standing right beside her, practically blocking the natural sunlight streaming through the window, was her husband Darnell. Darnell was a loudmouth grifter who constantly bragged about his massive entrepreneurial endeavors while secretly borrowing money from anyone foolish enough to answer his phone calls. He wore heavily distressed jeans and an oversized gold chain that looked like it would turn his neck green by noon. They had tracked me down using the location tag from a digital coffee shop receipt I had accidentally forwarded to Jamal's email months ago. They looked around the upscale cafe with extreme confusion, completely unaware that I lived in the multi-million-dollar penthouse directly above our heads. Tasha sneered at me, looking me up and down with intense disgust. She fully assumed I was only sitting in this expensive cafe to use the free internet because my imaginary cheap motel room lacked basic amenities. I ignored her obvious insult and calmly took another sip of my iced drink. I asked her what she wanted, keeping my tone completely flat professional and devoid of any emotion. Tasha slammed her hands down hard on my marble table, causing my green drink to slosh violently over the rim and stain the coaster. She leaned in close, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated entitlement. "I want my mother's ring," she hissed, her eyes narrowing. "The vintage diamond church ring. Jamal told us you stole it when you packed up her disgusting hospital bed and wheeled her out of his house. Hand it over right now, Maya, before I call the police and report a grand theft." Tasha went on to explain loudly and obnoxiously, completely ignoring the stares of the other customers, that she had recently been appointed the head of the usher board at their massive megachurch. She claimed she desperately needed the heirloom diamond ring to assert her dominance and flex her elevated status to the rest of the congregation this coming Sunday. She insisted that since I was officially no longer a part of the family, I had absolutely no legal or moral right to hold onto their precious family jewels. I just sat back and stared at her in silence. The specific ring she was talking about was currently locked safely inside my reinforced penthouse vault. It was placed there by Evelyn herself because she knew her daughter would try to pawn it the second she got her hands on it to buy more fake designer clothes. When I did not immediately respond to her ridiculous demands, Darnell decided it was his turn to act tough and defend his wife's honor. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, deliberately invading my personal space. He crossed his thick arms over his chest and glared down at me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "Listen here." He growled, his voice a low, threatening rumble meant to strike fear into my heart. "You are going to open that little knockoff bag of yours and give my wife exactly what belongs to her family. If you make me ask you twice, we are going to have a very serious problem right here in front of all these nice people." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with Darnell for even a fraction of a second. I refused to let him see an ounce of fear. Instead, I calmly reached down into my authentic, limited edition leather tote bag. Tasha smiled triumphantly, holding out her manicured hand, fully expecting me to produce the velvet jewelry box and hand it over in defeat. But I did not pull out a ring. I wrapped my hand around a thick, heavy 3-ring binder. I hoisted it out of my bag and slammed it down onto the marble table with a deafening crack. The sharp sound echoed through the quiet coffee shop like a gunshot, causing dozens of patrons to turn their heads and stare directly at our table. Tasha yanked her hand back in absolute shock, her triumphant smile completely vanishing. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, staring at the thick binder resting between us. I reached out and flipped the heavy plastic cover open. The pages inside were filled with hundreds of highly organized, color-coded, and highlighted medical documents. I looked right into Tasha's eyes and raised my voice just enough so the surrounding tables could hear every single word I was about to say. "These are 2 entire years of your mother's medical bills," I announced clearly and firmly. "Every single hospital stay, every massive copay for her specialized heart medication, every grueling physical therapy session, and the enormous cost of the custom motorized wheelchair she desperately needs to survive." I flipped aggressively through the crisp pages, pointing to the bottom right corner of each separate document. "And right here on every single line is my signature, paid in full, directly from my private bank accounts." I stood up from my chair, suddenly leveling the playing field and forcing them to look me in the eye. Tasha took a slight step back, visibly unnerved by my complete lack of intimidation and the undeniable physical proof of my financial superiority. I demanded to know exactly where she was when her mother's health insurance mysteriously lapsed last winter. I asked her loudly why her name was suspiciously absent from every single emergency room admission form for the past 24 months. I publicly humiliated her right there in the cafe, pointing out that she was entirely too busy buying fake designer jumpsuits out of car trunks to visit her own disabled mother in the hospital even once. I told her the only time she ever pretended to care about Miss Evelyn was when she thought there was a shiny piece of jewelry she could use to show off to a church congregation that secretly laughed at her behind her back anyway. Tasha's face turned a violent, humiliating shade of red. She stammered and sputtered, completely unable to form a single coherent sentence as the wealthy coffee shop patrons began whispering among themselves and giving her openly disgusted looks. Darnell slammed his fist violently on the table, desperately trying to regain control of the crumbling narrative. "You think you are better than us just because you have a little bit of credit card debt?" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly, completely missing the point of the binder. "I am a premier wealth management consultant. I make more money in a single week than you make in a whole year cleaning hospital toilets." I turned my sharp, unforgiving gaze directly onto Darnell. I let out a cold, deeply mocking laugh that cut right through his fragile ego. "A wealth management consultant," I repeated loudly, making sure the businessmen at the next table heard me. "Darnell, you run a pathetic, illegal pyramid scheme. You sell toxic, unregulated energy drinks out of the trunk of your leased sedan. You have completely maxed out 3 separate credit cards under Tasha's name. And just last month, you literally begged Jamal for $500 to keep your electricity from being shut off. Do not stand in my presence and pretend you are anything more than a glorified scam artist living entirely off your wife's imaginary social status." Darnell's eyes widened in sheer panic as I loudly broadcasted his complete financial ruin to the entire cafe. His profound embarrassment quickly twisted into unpredictable, aggressive rage. He lunged forward, raising his arm high, his face contorted with explosive anger. "Watch your mouth, you arrogant!" He started to yell, stepping aggressively into my personal space with his fist clenched. He never got to finish his threatening sentence. Before his heavy foot even fully touched the ground, a massive hand clamped down on his shoulder, like an unbreakable steel vise. It was Leon, my elite private security guard, who had been sitting quietly at a small table near the entrance, reading a newspaper, waiting for me to finish my work. Leon was a towering, heavily muscled ex-military professional who absolutely did not tolerate threats against his high-net-worth clients. Leon twisted Darnell's arm back just an inch, but it was perfectly calculated to make Darnell gasp loudly in sudden blinding pain. His knees buckled slightly under the intense pressure. Leon leaned in close and spoke in a terrifyingly calm, low voice right next to Darnell's ear. "I highly suggest you step back from the lady right now, sir, before I decide you are a physical threat that needs to be permanently neutralized and removed from this property." Darnell immediately threw his free hand up in surrender, his tough guy facade shattering into a million pathetic pieces. He backed away so fast he stumbled clumsily over a wooden chair. Tasha grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with unadulterated shock and genuine fear. They suddenly realized they had severely miscalculated my entire situation. I was not a helpless, broke divorcee hiding out in a random cafe. I was a powerful woman flanked by elite private security, casually handling high-level business in the lobby of a luxury building they could never afford to step foot in. Tasha realized she was entirely out of her depth, but her toxic, deeply ingrained pride would simply not let her leave quietly. She dragged a terrified Darnell toward the heavy glass exit doors, causing a massive scene as several patrons openly laughed at their frantic, cowardly retreat. Right before she violently pushed through the revolving doors, Tasha spun around to face me one last time. Her face was twisted in a hideous mask of pure venomous spite. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my chest. "You think you have won?" she screamed, her shrill voice echoing off the expensive glass walls of the building. "You are going to deeply regret this. You are going to regret disrespecting my family. Jamal just got the greatest news of his entire life today. He is about to be richer than you could ever possibly comprehend. You are going to be crawling back to us begging for scraps when he is done destroying you." She yanked Darnell out the door, and they scurried rapidly down the busy Atlanta sidewalk like terrified rats fleeing a rapidly sinking ship. I stood calmly in the middle of the quiet cafe, smoothing down the front of my silk blouse. I slowly sat back down at my marble table, closed my binder, and picked up my iced matcha latte. I took a slow, refreshing sip. I smiled warmly to myself, looking out the large glass window at the bustling city street. Tasha was completely right about one thing. Jamal had absolutely received some massive news today, but she had no idea that the monumental financial windfall her brother was currently celebrating was nothing more than an elaborate, beautifully constructed trap, and I was the one holding the trigger. Across town, miles away from my peaceful penthouse, the trap was already springing inside the $800,000 house I used to call home. My beautiful, brilliant 8-year-old daughter Zuri was currently executing her part of the mission with absolute precision. She was my Trojan horse. When I agreed to leave her with Jamal, he honestly thought he was winning a major legal victory. He thought he was taking away the one thing I loved most, purely to punish me. What he failed to realize was that I had not surrendered my child in defeat. I had strategically deployed her into enemy territory. Chloe had quickly moved all her personal belongings into my former master bedroom the very same afternoon I left. She was desperate to instantly step into the wealthy lifestyle she believed I had foolishly abandoned. Saturday morning, she decided to capitalize on her new living situation by filming a highly produced stepmom morning routine for her thousands of social media followers. She was obsessed with curating a flawless online image. She set up a massive glaring ring light right in the center of the pristine marble kitchen. She wore a luxurious white silk robe and had spent over 2 hours doing full glam makeup just to pretend she had effortlessly woken up looking that perfect. She pressed record on her phone and began speaking in a high-pitched, overly sweet voice about the profound joys of blending families, finding true love, and making fresh, organic avocado toast for her sweet new stepdaughter. She did not know Zuri was standing just outside the camera frame, holding a large, freshly opened carton of bright red fruit punch. Zuri waited for the exact moment Chloe turned her back to grab a silver serving knife. With the stealth of a seasoned professional, Zuri stepped forward and deliberately tipped the heavy carton. She did not just spill the juice randomly on the hardwood floor. She aimed directly for the pair of limited edition white designer mules Chloe had carelessly kicked off near the kitchen island. The dark red liquid splashed heavily, soaking completely into the expensive fabric, permanently ruining the shoes in a matter of seconds. Chloe turned around and let out a blood-curdling scream that instantly shattered her perfectly curated aesthetic. She dropped the silver knife and lunged forward, grabbing her ruined designer shoes with shaking hands. She completely lost her temper, dropping the fake sweet voice and screaming at Zuri. She called my daughter a clumsy little brat, aggressively pointing her finger in Zuri's face, and threatened to lock her in her bedroom without television for the rest of the entire weekend. But Zuri was entirely prepared for this exact reaction. The moment Chloe raised her voice, Zuri let out a loud, incredibly dramatic wail. She squeezed her eyes shut and forced massive tears to stream down her cheeks, just as Jamal walked into the kitchen wearing his expensive gym clothes. Jamal immediately took Zuri's side. He did not do this because he was a protective or loving father. He did it because loud noises and emotional conflict annoyed him, and he simply wanted the house to be perfectly quiet so he could drink his protein shake and watch sports in peace. He sharply reprimanded Chloe for screaming like a lunatic at a child over a stupid pair of shoes. He picked Zuri up, handed her his expensive tablet to keep her quiet, and coldly ordered Chloe to grab a mop and clean up the sticky red mess on the floor before it stained the wood. Chloe stood frozen in the center of the kitchen, her face flushed with extreme anger and deep humiliation. She was slowly realizing that the glamorous, carefree life she had envisioned was rapidly turning into an unpaid, highly stressful babysitting job. This daily friction was entirely by design. I knew Chloe possessed absolutely zero maternal instinct. She loved the idea of bagging a rich husband, riding in luxury cars, and taking selfies in a massive house, but she fiercely despised the actual reality of motherhood. She hated the constant noise, the sticky messes, and the heavy, unrelenting responsibility of caring for a child that was not hers. By leaving Zuri in her care, I forced Chloe to directly confront the grueling daily reality she had so arrogantly signed up for. I was systematically breaking their relationship from the inside out. I had promised Zuri that this arrangement was strictly for 1 week, I told my daughter to be incredibly brave to play the innocent victim perfectly and to make every single day as exhausting and frustrating as physically possible for her new stepmother. By Sunday morning, the tiny cracks in Jamal and Chloe's relationship had violently expanded into massive, unbridgeable canyons. Sunday was arguably the most important day of the week for Jamal's heavily inflated ego. He expected to walk into their massive megachurch wearing a custom-tailored suit, shaking hands with the prominent businessmen, local politicians, and church elders in his congregation. He needed a stunning trophy wife on his arm to complete the grand illusion of his perfect, highly successful life. He needed Chloe to temporarily drop the influencer act and play the role of the devoted conservative first lady of their household. I knew the exact details of this argument because the fallout was absolutely spectacular. Jamal had walked into the master bedroom adjusting his expensive watch and found Chloe putting the finishing touches on her outfit. She was wearing a skin-tight, deeply cut neon dress that was entirely inappropriate for a Sunday morning church service. He stopped dead in his tracks and demanded that she change immediately into something much more modest. He told her she needed to look like a respectable mother and a woman of faith, not a cheap club promoter looking for free drinks. That was the absolute wrong thing to say to a fiercely entitled young woman who had spent the entire previous night scrubbing dried red juice off the baseboards while her boyfriend slept soundly in the next room. Chloe completely exploded. She picked up a heavy silver hairbrush from the vanity and hurled it directly at Jamal's head. He ducked just in time, and the heavy brush smashed violently into the wall, shattering the glass on a framed photograph behind him. She screamed at the top of her lungs that she did not sign up to be a domestic maid or a boring conservative church wife for his ridiculous friends. She yelled that he had promised her a life of endless luxury, expensive shopping sprees, and exotic vacations, not a life trapped inside a suffocating house dealing with a screaming kid while he ignored her needs. Jamal yelled back, his deep voice booming aggressively down the hallway. He called her ungrateful, selfish, and childish. He pointed a firm finger at her and angrily reminded her that she was currently living entirely off his money, driving a car he paid for, and sleeping in a house he provided. He demanded she show some basic respect for his authority and do exactly as she was told if she wanted to continue enjoying his wealthy lifestyle. The argument quickly devolved into a vicious, ugly screaming match. Their voices echoed through the large, empty house filled with vicious personal insults and deep-seated resentment that had been brewing since the moment I walked out the door. They were so entirely consumed by their own toxic, selfish battle that they completely forgot about the 8-year-old girl supposedly under their care. They forgot that Zuri was remarkably observant, highly intelligent, and operating under very specific instructions from her real mother. They had absolutely no idea that while they were violently tearing each other apart in the upstairs hallway, my daughter was quietly slipping into Jamal's private home office on the ground floor. Zuri gently pushed the heavy office door open until it was just a crack wide. She crept silently across the plush carpet, remembering the exact mission I had whispered to her in the lawyer's office just a few days ago. She walked purposefully over to Jamal's massive mahogany desk. Sitting right next to his expensive computer monitor was a sleek, modern digital clock displaying the time in bright white numbers. I had personally purchased that specific clock for him months ago, under the guise of an early anniversary present. Zuri reached out with her small hands and carefully adjusted the angle of the clock just a tiny fraction of an inch. She made absolutely sure the dark glass face of the device was pointed directly toward the center of the room and had a clear, unobstructed view of the hallway through the partially open door. She smiled a brilliant, knowing smile to herself and quickly hurried back to her bedroom, shutting her door quietly before the screaming upstairs finally came to a tense halt. Jamal and Chloe thought they were completely alone in their miserable, chaotic reality. They did not know that perfectly hidden behind the dark-tinted glass of that ordinary digital clock was a state-of-the-art, high-definition nanny camera. Every single harsh shout, every violently thrown object, and every horrifying moment of shocking parental neglect was currently recording directly to a secure encrypted cloud server on my personal phone. The enemy camp was fully wired, and they were handing me exactly the ammunition I needed to completely destroy them. The morning after their explosive fight, Jamal woke up with a pounding headache and a house filled with heavy tension. He walked out to the brick mailbox at the end of his driveway, expecting to find nothing more than routine utility bills and angry notices from his increasingly impatient creditors. His luxury car rental business had been secretly hemorrhaging money for months, and his cash flow was dangerously thin. But nestled between the colorful junk mail flyers was a thick, crisp envelope made of premium heavy stock paper. It bore the embossed gold logo of Horizon Urban Development, the most prestigious and aggressive commercial real estate firm in the entire city of Atlanta. Jamal tore the envelope open, right there on the concrete driveway, the humid morning air suddenly feeling electric. As his eyes scanned the formal legal jargon printed on the heavy pages, his heart began to pound violently against his ribs. The city was aggressively moving forward with a massive historic revitalization project in the Sweet Auburn district. They needed to immediately acquire the massive abandoned commercial warehouse block to serve as the anchor for a sprawling new technology hub and luxury shopping center. And printed right there at the bottom of the page, in bold, undeniable black ink, was a formal buyout offer: $20 million. Jamal physically dropped to his knees on the driveway. He let out a loud, victorious shout that echoed down his quiet suburban street, causing the neighbor's dog to bark wildly. In his twisted, incredibly arrogant mind, he did not see this as his elderly mother's sudden fortune. He saw it entirely as his own personal lottery ticket. Years ago, when Miss Evelyn had first suffered her stroke and was heavily medicated in a rehabilitation facility, Jamal had taken cruel advantage of her vulnerable state. He had secretly drafted a sweeping comprehensive power of attorney document. He brazenly forged her signature on the dotted line and paid off a shady, unethical notary to officially stamp it. He had used that fake legal document to slowly drain her meager savings accounts, intercept her mail, and redirect her survivor benefits to fund his own lavish lifestyle. Now clutching a certified letter worth $20 million, Jamal fully believed that his forged piece of paper made him the undisputed king of Atlanta. He convinced himself that since his mother was safely out of the picture, dumped onto his supposedly broke ex-wife along with a measly $5,000 check, there was absolutely no one left to challenge his absolute authority over the estate. He completely forgot that he had never actually bothered to check the official county property deed. He never bothered to investigate the massive tax liens he assumed had caused the city to foreclose on the property years ago. He only saw the massive number on the page, and his blinding greed instantly overrode any basic sense of caution or legal logic. Jamal sprinted back inside the large house, completely ignoring the sticky juice stains still ruining the kitchen floor. He ran straight upstairs to the master bedroom, where Chloe was furiously stuffing her designer clothes into a suitcase, fully prepared to leave him after their vicious screaming match. He snatched the heavy bag right out of her hands and threw it casually across the room. Before she could start yelling again, he shoved the $20 million offer letter directly into her face. Chloe read the astronomical number, and her angry, resentful scowl instantly melted into a wide, fiercely greedy smile. The massive argument from the previous night, the ruined aesthetic, and her deep hatred of playing a mother figure to Zuri were entirely forgotten in the blinding face of immense wealth. Jamal told her to put her makeup back on and grab her purse because they were going shopping. Less than an hour later, they strolled confidently through the glass doors of the most exclusive exotic car dealership in the city. Jamal was operating purely on arrogant delusion and the intoxicating promise of impending millions. He demanded the absolute best vehicle on the showroom floor. The salesman, smelling the desperation of a man trying to prove his worth, directed them to a sleek, heavily customized icy white sports car with a blood-red leather interior. The price tag was a staggering $200,000. Jamal did not even try to negotiate. He slapped down a massive down payment using the very last remaining available funds in his rapidly failing business credit account. He completely drained his emergency reserves to secure the financing. He did not care about the shockingly high interest rate or the crippling monthly payments that would soon follow. In his mind, he was already a multimillionaire, and this car was simply the first small reward for his imaginary financial genius. Driving back to the suburbs in their roaring new luxury vehicle, Jamal's inflated ego reached an absolute uncontrollable fever pitch. He could not wait another second to rub his newly acquired wealth in my face and prove his dominance to his social circle. He pulled the bright white sports car right into the driveway, propping his latest model smartphone up on the expensive leather dashboard. With a smug, arrogant grin, he hit the button to start a live broadcast on his public social media page. Because of his flashy lifestyle and prominent status at the megachurch, his viewer count skyrocketed instantly. Within minutes, hundreds of his fraternity brothers' church members, local business associates, and gossiping neighbors tuned in to watch the spectacle. Jamal leaned back in the plush driver's seat wearing his expensive designer sunglasses indoors and began to speak with sickening arrogance. He held the certified Horizon Urban Development letter right up to the camera lens. He carefully placed his thumb over the exact property address to maintain a sense of mystery, but he made absolutely sure everyone watching could clearly read the bold $20 million figure printed at the bottom. He laughed loudly and deeply into the microphone, shaking his head in a theatrical display of mock pity. He then decided to publicly address me directly to his massive audience. He called me his bitter, thoroughly broke ex-wife. He told his entire audience that I had made the absolute biggest mistake of my pathetic life by walking away from a true visionary business mind. He bragged endlessly that while I was busy scrubbing dirty hospital floors and changing his disabled mother's adult diapers in some cheap rundown motel room across town, he was actively stepping into a level of generational wealth I could never even begin to comprehend. He patted Chloe on the thigh, pulling her into the frame so she could blow a sarcastic kiss to the camera. He claimed that real high-value men always trade up for a much better life, and that dumping his heavy baggage was the greatest financial decision he ever made. But simply bragging to a digital screen was not nearly enough to satisfy his raging narcissism. Jamal desperately needed a physical audience to properly worship his new status. Right there on the live broadcast, he made a grand, sweeping announcement. He declared that he was hosting a massive, fully catered New Beginnings party at his house the very next evening. He formally invited his entire local fraternity, chapter the senior pastoral leadership of the church, and every single person who had ever dared to doubt his supreme business acumen. He promised endless bottles of expensive imported champagne, top-tier gourmet catering, and a live DJ to celebrate his massive victory. Most importantly, he announced that the party would feature a formal public contract signing ceremony. He told his audience that the lead developers from Horizon Urban Development would be arriving at his home during the party to officially close the biggest real estate deal of the decade, right in his living room. He wanted the entire city of Atlanta to witness his glorious coronation as the newest real estate mogul in the state. He wanted to cement his legacy as a financial titan while simultaneously humiliating me in front of everyone we both knew. The live video ended with Jamal revving the incredibly loud engine of the sports car, the sound echoing obnoxiously through his quiet neighborhood. Miles away, high above the bustling city streets, I sat comfortably in the quiet elegance of my Buckhead penthouse. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the steam rising from my cup of imported herbal tea. My tablet was propped up on the marble kitchen island, playing Jamal's entire live broadcast in crystal-clear high-definition video. I watched him wave the certified letter around. I watched Chloe flaunt her new designer sunglasses. I listened to every single degrading insult he hurled at my name, and I watched the comments section flood with congratulations from people who had entirely ignored me for the last 8 years. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel humiliated or hurt by his vicious words. Instead, a slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. Jamal had just perfectly set the stage for his own spectacular public destruction. He had built a massive towering pedestal for himself, inviting hundreds of people to watch him stand on top of it completely unaware that the foundation was made of absolute dust. I reached across the marble counter and picked up my personal smartphone. I opened my encrypted contacts list and scrolled down until I found the direct private number for the senior lead developer at Horizon Urban Development. The phone rang only twice before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end. I kept my voice perfectly calm and completely composed. I informed the developer that I had seen their certified offer letter regarding the Sweet Auburn commercial block. The developer immediately recognized my name as the sole legal owner hidden behind the blind trust. He eagerly asked if I was ready to discuss the final terms of the $20 million acquisition. I took a slow sip of my warm tea, looking down at the frozen image of Jamal's arrogant face on my tablet screen. I told the developer that I was absolutely ready to finalize the agreement. Yes, I said, my voice cold and sharp as a diamond. I will be at the celebration party Jamal Davis is hosting tomorrow evening. Bring the final contracts directly to that address. We are going to close this deal in front of a very large audience. The following evening, the quiet suburban street where I used to live was completely transformed into a chaotic circus of unwarranted arrogance and borrowed money. I sat in the plush leather back seat of my private tinted SUV parked discreetly just half a block away from the $800,000 house. I watched through the dark window as valet drivers frantically sprinted up and down the street, attempting to park an endless stream of luxury vehicles. Jamal had spared absolutely no expense for his grand coronation. He had hired the most exclusive catering company in Atlanta. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos navigated the crowded lawn carrying silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, imported oysters, and champagne glasses filled with incredibly expensive vintage wine. Massive strobe lights flashed from the backyard, casting vibrant purple and gold hues against the night sky, while the heavy bass of loud hip-hop music rattled the windows of the surrounding homes. Jamal had clearly maxed out his final desperate lines of credit to fund this spectacular illusion. He wanted the entire city to witness his ascension to the billionaire class. My private security guard, Leon, sat in the front seat monitoring the live feed from the nanny camera hidden inside the digital clock in Jamal's office. Through the earpiece, I could hear every single arrogant conversation echoing through the main living room. Tasha and Darnell were currently holding court near the massive marble fireplace, acting as if they were the wealthy aristocrats of Atlanta. Tasha was wearing another hideous skin-tight designer knockoff, holding a crystal champagne flute and loudly bragging to the senior pastor's wife. She claimed that Jamal was going to buy her a sprawling vacation villa in Cabo San Lucas by the end of the month. She boasted that her family had always possessed superior business genetics and that they were finally taking their rightful place among the global elite. Right beside her, Darnell was aggressively handing out his cheap glossy business cards to Jamal's wealthy fraternity brothers. He was brazenly pitching his illegal pyramid scheme, falsely claiming that he had been officially appointed as the chief financial officer of Jamal's new real estate empire. He promised them guaranteed returns on their investments, trying to hustle thousands of dollars from unsuspecting guests who believed his close proximity to Jamal made him legitimate. Meanwhile, Chloe was treating my former living room like her own personal photography studio. She had hired a professional videographer to follow her around for her social media channels. She posed dramatically next to a massive, ridiculous ice sculpture carved into the shape of a giant dollar sign. She wore a sparkling diamond necklace that Jamal had undoubtedly purchased on credit just hours before. She looked down her nose at the older church members refusing to speak to anyone who did not have a massive social media following. She was completely intoxicated by the delusion of endless wealth, entirely unaware that the foundation of her glamorous new life was actively crumbling beneath her expensive designer shoes. Suddenly, a sleek black town car pulled smoothly into the circular driveway, bypassing the chaotic valet stand. A sharp, distinguished man stepped out of the back seat. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, carried a slim leather briefcase, and possessed an aura of absolute, undeniable authority. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior lead developer for Horizon Urban Development. He walked up the front steps, his face completely unreadable and strictly professional. Inside the house, Jamal spotted Mr. Sterling walking through the grand foyer. Jamal's eyes widened with manic excitement. He began clapping his hands loudly, signaling the DJ to immediately cut the loud music. The heavy bass abruptly stopped, leaving a sudden echoing silence in the packed house. Over 200 guests turned their heads, their conversations halting as they looked toward the center of the room. Jamal eagerly grabbed a wireless microphone from the DJ booth and stepped confidently into the middle of the living room, standing right beneath the massive crystal chandelier. He tapped the microphone twice, a sickeningly smug grin plastered across his face. "Welcome, family, friends, and esteemed colleagues," Jamal announced, his deep voice booming through the expensive surround sound speakers. "We are gathered here tonight to witness history. They say that in order to achieve greatness, a man must be willing to shed his dead weight. He must be willing to walk away from small-minded people who do not understand his massive vision." The crowd murmured, some cheering loudly, while others shifted uncomfortably at the blatant insult directed at me. Jamal continued, raising his glass of champagne high into the air. "I made the hard choices. I dumped the baggage holding me back, and today, the universe has rewarded my relentless grind. Tonight, we are officially closing a $20 million real estate deal that will completely change the skyline of Atlanta." The crowd erupted into massive applause. Tasha screamed loudly, holding her glass up, while Chloe clapped enthusiastically for the cameras. Jamal gestured grandly toward the foyer, inviting Mr. Sterling to join him in the center of the room. "Please welcome the man holding the contract to my future, the senior developer from Horizon Urban Development," Jamal declared. Mr. Sterling walked slowly toward Jamal. He did not smile. He did not wave to the cheering crowd. He stopped a few feet away from Jamal, looking around the obnoxious party with a highly critical, unimpressed glare. Jamal reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a custom gold-plated pen. He held it out toward Mr. Sterling, fully expecting the developer to hand over the paperwork so he could sign his name and finalize his ultimate triumph in front of an adoring audience. But Mr. Sterling did not take the pen. He did not even look at it. Instead, he placed his slim leather briefcase on a nearby glass table, popped the polished silver latches, and pulled out a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. The crowd fell into a hushed, anticipatory silence. Jamal's arrogant smile began to falter, just a fraction of an inch, as Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses and looked him dead in the eye. "I am sorry to interrupt your celebration, Mr. Davis," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it carried a sharp, piercing clarity that cut perfectly through the quiet room. "But I am absolutely not here for you." Jamal blinked in total confusion. He let out a nervous, strained laugh, looking out at the crowd before turning back to the developer. "What are you talking about?" Jamal asked, his voice losing its confident boom. "We spoke on the phone. You sent the certified offer letter to my house yesterday morning. The Sweet Auburn estate. The $20 million. Hand over the contracts so we can get this done." Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He held up a copy of the official county property deed. Horizon Urban Development sent a preliminary offer letter to the mailing address on file for the estate, Mr. Sterling explained calmly and methodically. "However, upon conducting our mandatory title searches and legal verifications this morning, we discovered a massive discrepancy in your claims. The power of attorney document you submitted to our firm is entirely legally void. The city records explicitly show that you have absolutely zero legal claim ownership or financial interest in the Sweet Auburn commercial block." A collective gasp echoed through the massive living room. The senior pastor dropped his cocktail napkin. The fraternity brothers exchanged bewildered, panicked glances. Tasha froze completely, her champagne glass hovering halfway to her mouth. Chloe stopped posing for the videographer, her smile instantly turning into a terrified scowl. Jamal's face drained of all color. The arrogant king of Atlanta suddenly looked like a terrified, cornered child. He aggressively stepped toward Mr. Sterling, pointing his finger in the developer's face. "You are lying!" Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with rising panic. "My mother owned that land. She is a disabled, incompetent old woman. I have the legal rights to all her assets. I am the sole beneficiary. You need to check your completely broken system right now, because that $20 million belongs to me." Mr. Sterling took a calm step back from Jamal's aggressive posture. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of professional pity and extreme disgust. "Your mother is neither incompetent nor the current owner of the property, Mr. Davis." Mr. Sterling stated loudly, ensuring every single guest in the room heard the undeniable truth. The property taxes were completely paid off 2 years ago by a private blind trust, and yesterday afternoon the original owner legally transferred 100% of the deed to a new sole proprietor. I am here tonight because the actual legal owner of the Sweet Auburn estate instructed me to bring the final contracts to this exact address. Jamal began hyperventilating. He violently ran his hands over his shaved head, his carefully constructed reality completely shattering into a million sharp pieces. He screamed, completely losing control of his temper in front of the entire church congregation. "Who is the owner?" Before Mr. Sterling could answer, the heavy oak front doors of the house swung wide open. The sudden movement caught the attention of the guests near the foyer. The crowd slowly parted like the Red Sea, falling into an absolutely stunned, breathless silence. I stepped over the threshold and walked directly into the blinding light of the crystal chandelier. I was dressed flawlessly in a custom floor-length emerald green gown that hugged my curves perfectly. My hair was styled in sleek, elegant waves, and I wore a subtle, confident smile that radiated pure, unstoppable power. I did not look like a broken, discarded ex-wife. I looked like an undisputed queen arriving to reclaim her stolen throne. And right in front of me, sitting in her motorized wheelchair, was Ms. Evelyn. I pushed her gently into the center of the massive room. Evelyn looked absolutely radiant. I had hired a professional styling team for her that afternoon. She wore a beautiful tailored silver dress, her hair was freshly pressed, and she held her chin high with the profound dignity of a matriarch who had finally been set free from her abuser. Jamal stared at us, his eyes practically bulging out of his skull. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked at my stunning gown, then at his mother, and then finally at the heavy legal documents resting in Mr. Sterling's hands. The horrifying realization slammed into him like a speeding freight train. I walked calmly through the silent, staring crowd, leaving Evelyn parked comfortably near the edge of the impromptu stage. I stepped right up to the marble fireplace, stopping mere inches away from my trembling, hyperventilating ex-husband. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute terror and utter disbelief. I reached out smoothly, my manicured hand wrapping firmly around the handle of the wireless microphone he was still clutching. I effortlessly pulled it right out of his weak, stunned grip. I turned my back to him, looked out at the massive sea of shocked faces, and prepared to deliver the final crushing blow. The silence in the massive living room was absolute. Over 200 guests stood completely frozen, their eyes darting frantically between me, Mr. Sterling, and the hyperventilating man I used to call my husband. The obnoxious purple and gold strobe lights from the backyard continued to flash through the large glass windows, casting harsh, chaotic shadows across the stunned faces of the crowd. The videographer Chloe had hired was still standing near the ice sculpture, the red recording light on his heavy camera, blinking steadily, capturing every single second of this spectacular downfall. I held the wireless microphone firmly in my manicured hand, feeling the cold metal ground me as I prepared to dismantle Jamal's entire fake reality brick by brick. I looked out at the sea of wealthy church members, arrogant fraternity brothers, and gossiping neighbors. 4 days ago, I began my voice echoing clearly and powerfully through the expensive surround sound speakers. The man standing behind me sat in a luxury law firm and demanded a divorce. He demanded this house. He demanded his car rental business. He demanded primary custody of our daughter. And he demanded that I walk away with absolutely nothing. A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. The senior pastor frowned, crossing his arms over his chest as he listened intently. But he made one massive, fatal miscalculation. I continued my gaze, locking onto Tasha, who looked like she was about to pass out from sheer panic. He viewed the woman who gave birth to him as nothing more than a financial burden. He complained about her medical bills. He hated how her wheelchair ruined the aesthetic of his perfectly curated life. So when I told him the only thing I wanted from our 8-year marriage was to take Ms. Evelyn with me, he did not hesitate. He did not argue. Instead, he laughed. I paused, letting the heavy weight of my words settle over the room. I reached into my designer emerald clutch and pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper. I held it up high under the bright glow of the crystal chandelier so everyone could see it. Jamal sold his own mother to me for exactly $5,000. I announced, my voice slicing through the room like a perfectly sharpened blade. He wrote this check as a severance package to get rid of what he called his two biggest headaches. He threw his own flesh and blood away for the price of a cheap weekend vacation. A loud collective gasp erupted from the church congregation. The senior pastor's wife covered her mouth in absolute horror. The elderly women in the usher board, who had known Ms. Evelyn for decades, began whispering furiously, shooting venomous glares at Jamal. In our community, abandoning your mother was the ultimate unforgivable sin. Jamal's carefully constructed image as a devoted, God-fearing family man completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. I turned around to face Jamal. He was sweating profusely, his expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He was still clutching a crystal glass filled with expensive vintage champagne. I walked right up to him, my eyes locked onto his terrified face. I held the $5,000 check directly over his glass and simply let it go. The paper fluttered down and landed perfectly in the bubbling golden liquid. The ink immediately began to bleed, ruining the expensive drink, just as thoroughly as he had ruined his own life. "Consider your garbage collected," I whispered, stepping back as he stared down at the soggy paper floating in his glass. I turned my attention away from him, entirely dismissing him like an unruly child, and walked confidently toward the massive marble kitchen island. Mr. Sterling was waiting there, his leather briefcase open, the heavy legal documents arranged in a perfectly neat stack. He handed me a sleek, custom-engraved pen with a respectful nod. The crowd watched in breathless silence as I leaned over the cool marble. With a few swift, deliberate strokes of the pen, I formally executed the contract. I signed my name permanently, securing the $20 million acquisition of the Sweet Auburn estate. I handed the pen back to Mr. Sterling. "Congratulations, ma'am," he said loudly enough for the front row of guests to hear. "The funds will be securely transferred to your private accounts by tomorrow morning." I thanked him warmly, and he quickly packed up his briefcase, casting one final, pitying look at Jamal before walking out the front door. He did not even bother saying goodbye to the man who had invited him. I picked up the microphone again, turning back to the stunned audience. "For years, Jamal told all of you that I was just a low-level hospital cleaner," I said, making direct eye contact with a group of his fraternity brothers who had always treated me with blatant disrespect. "He let you believe he was the sole provider, the brilliant business mind carrying the weight of our family. The truth is, I own a highly lucrative medical logistics company. I secure multi-million-dollar federal supply chain contracts. I paid the down payments for his first fleet of rental cars. And I was the one who secretly paid off the massive tax liens on the Sweet Auburn property, ensuring it remained fully under Ms. Evelyn's legal control until she graciously transferred the deed to me yesterday." Jamal let out a pathetic, strangled sound. He was backed up against the marble fireplace, pulling nervously at his silk tie as if it were suddenly choking him. But I was not finished. I walked toward the center of the room, gesturing broadly to the high ceilings, the expensive artwork, and the towering glass windows. "Since we are clearing the air tonight, I think it is incredibly important to discuss the very ground we are standing on," I announced. "Jamal loves to brag about this $800,000 house. He loves to show it off on his live broadcasts. But what he conveniently failed to mention to his followers is that his luxury car rental business has been secretly hemorrhaging money for over a year. He is drowning in high-interest debt. To fund his lavish lifestyle and buy expensive gifts for his new girlfriend, he took out a massive, highly leveraged commercial business loan. And he used this exact house as the primary collateral. Chloe let out a sharp shriek. She dropped her designer purse onto the hardwood floor, her face completely pale. She stared at Jamal, realizing that the millionaire she thought she had successfully stolen was actually entirely broke. I looked directly at Jamal, my smile fading into a cold, hardened expression of pure business. "When you filed for divorce, you thought you were protecting your assets," I said, my tone completely merciless. "You thought you were leaving me with nothing, but the bank holding your massive business loan recently bundled their high-risk commercial debts and sold them to a private investment firm, a firm that is wholly owned by my logistics company." The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. Darnell, who had been aggressively passing out his fake business cards just 10 minutes ago, slowly backed away into the shadows, desperately trying to distance himself from the radioactive fallout. Tasha looked like she was going to be physically sick. She realized that the brother she had relentlessly championed was a complete and total fraud, and the sister-in-law she had viciously mocked was now her incredibly wealthy landlord. "Jamal," I said clearly into the microphone, "you have missed 3 consecutive payments. You are officially in severe default. I own the paper on this house. I own the paper on your business. And I am officially calling in the debt. You and your ridiculous girlfriend have exactly 48 hours to pack up your cheap designer knockoffs and vacate my property. If you are still inside this house by Tuesday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically drag you out onto the front lawn." The party completely imploded. The church gossips began talking loudly, their voices overlapping in a frantic frenzy of scandalized whispers. The fraternity brothers aggressively set their champagne glasses down on the tables and began walking toward the exit, refusing to be associated with a man who had just been publicly humiliated and financially ruined by his ex-wife. Chloe completely lost her mind. She ran up to Jamal, hitting him hard in the chest with her fists, screaming that he was a broke liar and a pathetic loser, before turning around and sprinting up the stairs to pack her bags. Jamal's fragile, massive ego could not handle the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. He watched his friends leave. He watched the pastor shake his head in disgust. He watched his fake empire burn to the ground in front of hundreds of witnesses. Something dark and violent snapped inside his brain. He let out a furious animalistic roar and lunged across the living room directly at me. His hands were curled into tight fists, his face twisted in a mask of explosive rage. He intended to strike me to physically punish me for stripping away his power. He never even made it halfway across the floor. Leon, my massive private security guard, moved with terrifying speed. He stepped smoothly in front of me, intercepting Jamal's aggressive charge. Leon grabbed Jamal by the lapels of his custom suit, lifted him slightly off the ground, and slammed him violently into the nearest drywall. The heavy impact cracked the expensive plaster and sent a large framed photograph of Jamal crashing to the floor, the glass shattering into hundreds of jagged pieces. Leon pinned him firmly against the wall, his massive forearm pressing heavily against Jamal's chest, completely neutralizing the threat in less than 3 seconds. Jamal struggled uselessly against Leon's iron grip. His expensive suit was wrinkled and covered in white plaster dust. His face was red, tears of absolute humiliation and pure rage streaming down his cheeks. He glared at me over Leon's thick arm, his chest heaving as he desperately gasped for air. He realized he had absolutely no money, no house, no business, and no respect left in the entire city. But his toxic, deeply malicious nature refused to let him surrender completely. He needed to inflict one final wound. "You think you won?" Jamal screamed, his voice cracking and echoing through the rapidly emptying living room. "You can take the money, you can take the business, you can take this damn house, but you will never see Zuri again. I have primary custody, Maya. I am her legal guardian, and I swear to God, I will move her across the country and teach her to hate your guts for the rest of her miserable life." I did not flinch at his desperate, venomous threat. I simply looked at him pinned against the cracked drywall like a helpless insect and offered him a slow, chilling smile. "You can certainly try, Jamal," I replied, my voice completely steady. "But you are going to need a lot of money to move across the country. And as of right now, you do not even have enough credit left to buy a bus ticket." I signaled to Leon. He effortlessly released his iron grip, letting Jamal slide down the wall and slump onto the expensive hardwood floor. I turned around, grasped the handles of Ms. Evelyn's wheelchair, and pushed her calmly out of the massive front doors. We descended the front steps and climbed into the waiting, air-conditioned comfort of my private SUV. As the driver pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruined remains of my ex-husband's life in the rearview mirror, I knew the most critical phase of my plan was about to unfold inside that house. The aftermath of my dramatic departure was swift and brutal. Within 20 minutes, the sprawling $800,000 house was completely abandoned by every single guest. The caterers hastily packed up their silver trays, demanding cash payment that Jamal could not provide, before angrily driving off. The DJ dismantled his equipment in absolute silence. Even Tasha and Darnell slipped out through the back patio door, too cowardly to face Jamal after his humiliating public exposure. The loud, obnoxious hip-hop music was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The flashing purple and gold strobe lights had been unplugged, leaving the massive living room bathed in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead lights. Plaster dust settled over the ruined ice sculpture, which was rapidly melting onto the floor. Jamal remained slumped against the wall for a long time. His mind was racing frantically, trying to find a loophole, a hidden account, or some imaginary lifeline. He pulled out his smartphone and aggressively dialed the automated number for his primary business credit card. He typed in his account number with trembling fingers, praying he had enough available credit to hire a vicious divorce attorney to fight me. The automated voice delivered the crushing blow. His account was completely frozen. He tried his personal gold card. Frozen. He tried the joint checking account he had drained months ago, overdrawn and locked. My logistics company had officially assumed control of his debt, and I had instructed my financial team to immediately freeze every single line of credit attached to his name the absolute second the contract was signed. He was entirely, undeniably broke. Upstairs, the heavy thud of suitcases hitting the floor echoed down the hallway. Chloe was in a state of absolute unhinged panic. She had sprinted into the master bedroom, thrown open her massive walk-in closet, and began frantically stuffing her expensive designer dresses, shoes, and handbags into her expensive luggage. She did not care about folding anything. She only cared about salvaging whatever items she could potentially pawn or sell to maintain her illusion of wealth. She realized with terrifying clarity that the endless money stream had completely dried up. She was not going to be the wife of a $20 million real estate mogul. She was about to be completely homeless, tethered to a man who possessed nothing but staggering debt and an impending eviction notice. She dragged two massive suitcases out of the bedroom and managed to haul them down the grand staircase, the heavy wheels bumping loudly against the wooden steps. She found Jamal sitting on the expensive living room sofa. He had not started packing. He had not formulated a plan. Instead, he had grabbed a half-empty bottle of vintage champagne left behind by the caterers and was drinking it straight from the neck. His tie was undone. His expensive suit jacket was thrown carelessly on the floor, and his eyes were glazed over with a pathetic mixture of severe depression and heavy intoxication. Chloe kicked his leg hard with the pointed toe of her designer shoe. "Get up!" she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing in the empty house. "We have to leave." She said she was going to call an expensive car service to take her to a luxury hotel downtown. Jamal let out a dark, bitter laugh, taking another long swallow of the warm champagne. "Call them," with what he slurred, staring blankly at the melted ice sculpture. "The cards are blocked. All of them. Maya took everything. We have no money. We have nowhere to go." Chloe's face contorted in absolute horror. The reality of her situation finally crashed down upon her. She was trapped. Her rage, initially directed at Jamal's massive financial failure, suddenly boiled over into a violent, uncontrollable frenzy. She needed an outlet for her explosive anger. She needed someone smaller and weaker to punish for her ruined life. At that exact moment, Zuri walked timidly out of the kitchen hallway. She was wearing her soft pink pajamas, clutching her favorite stuffed bear. The loud yelling and the chaotic noise of the party ending had kept her awake. She rubbed her sleepy eyes and looked at the mess in the living room. She took a step toward the sofa, her small voice cutting through the heavy tension. "Daddy?" she asked softly. "I am hungry. Can I have a snack?" It was a completely innocent request, but to Chloe, it was the absolute breaking point. The sight of my daughter, the living, breathing reminder of the woman who had just publicly destroyed her entire world, pushed Chloe straight over the edge. She dropped the handle of her heavy suitcase and stormed aggressively across the living room. Jamal did not even look up. He took another deep drink from his bottle, entirely ignoring his daughter's presence and the violently angry woman marching toward her. Chloe reached Zuri in 3 long strides. Before Zuri could even register the danger, Chloe's hand shot out and grabbed my daughter violently by her upper arm. Her long, manicured acrylic nails dug sharply into Zuri's soft skin. Zuri let out a loud, terrified shriek, dropping her stuffed bear onto the hardwood floor as Chloe yanked her aggressively forward. "You want a snack?" Chloe screamed, getting right into Zuri's tearful face. Her breath smelled of stale wine and pure hatred. "You think anyone cares if you are hungry? Look around you, you little brat. Everything is gone. Your precious mother abandoned you. She dumped you here because she does not want you. She hates you. We all hate you." Zuri began to cry loudly, genuine tears of fear mixing with the strategic role she was playing. She struggled against Chloe's tight grip, crying out for her father. "Daddy, help me! She is hurting me, Daddy!" Jamal sat less than 10 feet away. He heard every single word. He saw Chloe digging her nails into his daughter's arm. He saw the terror in Zuri's eyes, and he did absolutely nothing. He did not stand up. He did not tell Chloe to let go. He simply turned his head away, stared blankly at the cracked drywall, and lifted the champagne bottle to his lips once again. He willfully abandoned his child to protect his own miserable, drunken peace. Chloe sneered, empowered by Jamal's pathetic inaction. She dragged Zuri roughly down the hallway toward the kitchen. Zuri's bare feet slid desperately against the polished wood as she tried to pull away. Chloe dragged her straight to the heavy solid wood door of the walk-in pantry. She yanked the door open, shoving Zuri violently inside the cramped windowless space. "You can stay in the dark until you learn to shut your mouth," Chloe hissed viciously. She slammed the heavy door shut, completely cutting off the light, and loudly engaged the metal deadbolt lock on the outside. Inside the pitch-black pantry, Zuri pounded her small fists against the solid wood. "Let me out," she cried loudly. "It is dark, Daddy, please." The muffled sounds of her desperate pleas echoed down the hallway, but Chloe simply walked away, returning to her suitcases in the living room. Jamal remained motionless on the sofa, completely dead inside, willingly allowing his 8-year-old daughter to be locked in a dark closet by an enraged, abusive woman. They thought they were completely alone. They thought their horrifying actions would remain a dark, unspoken secret within the walls of their ruined home. They thought nobody was watching. But right across the hallway, through the partially open door of Jamal's home office, the sleek digital clock sat perfectly positioned on the mahogany desk. Behind its dark glass face, the high-definition lens of the hidden nanny camera captured every single horrifying second of the abuse. The sensitive internal microphone recorded the sickening sound of Chloe's nails digging into Zuri's arm. It recorded the vicious, psychologically damaging lies Chloe screamed into my daughter's face. It captured the loud, undeniable click of the metal deadbolt locking a terrified child in the dark. And most damning of all, the camera captured Jamal sitting passively on the sofa, actively ignoring his daughter's desperate cries for help while he continued to drink. It was a flawless, undeniable masterpiece of legal evidence recorded in stunning 4K resolution. Inside the pitch-black pantry, the heavy pounding against the door slowly stopped. The loud, terrified crying abruptly ceased, replaced by complete silence. Zuri sat down comfortably on a soft bag of flour resting on the bottom shelf. She wiped the fake tears from her cheeks in the darkness. Her heart was beating fast, but she was not broken. She was her mother's daughter, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. She reached up and tapped the screen of the sleek smartwatch strapped securely to her wrist. The small device emitted a faint, comforting blue glow in the dark closet. I had explicitly disabled all the distracting games and features on the watch, programming it with only one function: a direct encrypted text message line to my personal phone. Zuri quickly opened the messaging application. With steady, incredibly brave fingers, she typed out the single prearranged code word we had practiced a dozen times before I left her there. Checkmate. She pressed send. The tiny screen confirmed the message was delivered. She leaned back against the shelves, safe in the knowledge that her part of the dangerous mission was officially over. Now it was my turn to completely obliterate them. Miles away, sitting in the back of my luxury SUV as we drove toward my Buckhead penthouse, my phone vibrated sharply in my hand. I looked down at the illuminated screen. The single word glowed brightly against the dark background. A fierce protective fire ignited in my chest. I immediately forwarded the live cloud server link containing the horrifying 4K video footage directly to my senior legal team. I told my driver to turn the vehicle around immediately. We were not going home. We were going straight to the police station. While my legal team aggressively filed the emergency child endangerment warrants with the police department that night, ensuring Jamal would be completely trapped by the time the family court judge opened their doors, my financial team was already executing the next devastating phase of my plan. I did not just want Jamal to lose his wealth. I wanted him to watch his entire identity be physically stripped away. The bright, unforgiving Atlanta sun rose over the massive asphalt lot of Jamal's luxury car rental business. Jamal arrived at his leasing office early, his eyes bloodshot and his hands trembling. He had spent the entire night desperately trying to shuffle imaginary funds between his frozen bank accounts. His business was his ultimate pride and joy. It was the physical manifestation of the fake success he paraded online. Parked in perfect gleaming rows across the lot were the pristine Mercedes SUVs, Range Rovers, and customized Bentleys he rented out to local rappers, athletes, and wannabe social media influencers. He barely had time to unlock the glass front door of his office before the deep, vibrating rumble of heavy diesel engines shook the pavement beneath his expensive leather shoes. A massive, highly coordinated convoy of heavy-duty tow trucks and extended flatbeds rolled aggressively onto the private lot. They moved with military precision, immediately blocking the front gates and the rear exits so nothing could escape. Men wearing high-visibility vests stepped out of the heavy trucks carrying thick metal chains and electronic clipboards. Jamal sprinted out of his office, his face flushed with panic. He shouted at the lead dispatcher, aggressively demanding that they get their trucks off his private property immediately. The dispatcher, a burly man who had dealt with hundreds of fake millionaires, completely ignored Jamal's screaming. He calmly pulled a thick stack of legal repossession orders from his clipboard and shoved them directly into Jamal's chest. Since my medical logistics company had officially acquired his toxic commercial debt, I was now his sole creditor. The terms of his original highly leveraged business loan were absolutely ironclad. 3 consecutive missed payments meant total immediate forfeiture of the secured collateral, and every single luxury vehicle sitting on that asphalt lot was legally listed as collateral. Jamal watched in sheer paralyzed horror as the repo men went to work. They did not care about the expensive custom rims or the pristine paint jobs. They quickly hooked heavy steel chains to the axles of the shiny vehicles and aggressively winched them up onto the tilted flatbeds. The loud grinding sound of metal on metal echoed across the property. Jamal's 3 remaining employees walked out of the leasing office holding their morning coffee cups and watched their arrogant boss lose his entire empire in a matter of minutes. Jamal frantically dialed his bank, his lawyers, and his fraternity brothers, but every single call went straight to voicemail. Nobody wanted anything to do with a man who had been publicly destroyed. Even the flashy $200,000 white sports car he had proudly purchased for Chloe just the day before was loaded onto a tow truck. The exotic car dealership had instantly canceled the financing agreement the moment they realized his credit was entirely frozen. Within 1 hour, the massive, bustling luxury car lot was reduced to an empty, oil-stained patch of black asphalt. His employees packed their personal belongings, threw their office keys onto the empty receptionist's desk, and walked off the property without saying a single word to him. Jamal was left standing completely alone in the morning heat. He had to endure the ultimate crushing humiliation of opening a rideshare application on his phone and waiting 20 minutes for a battered economy sedan to drive him back to his own house. When the cheap rideshare finally dropped him off at the end of his sprawling suburban driveway, Jamal felt physically sick. He walked slowly up the front steps, the heavy wooden door feeling like the entrance to a tomb. The house was suffocatingly quiet. He walked into the grand foyer and stopped dead in his tracks. Chloe was standing by the front door. She had lined up all 6 of her massive overstuffed designer suitcases perfectly in a row. She was wearing her large dark sunglasses indoors and was furiously typing on her smartphone, waiting for her own luxury black car service to arrive. Jamal's massive ego completely shattered. The arrogant king of Atlanta suddenly morphed into a pathetic, desperate beggar. He dropped to his knees right there on the expensive hardwood floor. He reached out and grabbed the hem of Chloe's expensive designer jacket, begging her not to leave him. He pleaded with her, his voice cracking with genuine panic. He promised her that he could fix the massive financial disaster. He swore that he still had one ultimate trump card left to play. He desperately explained that he still held primary legal custody of Zuri and that he was going to hire a ruthless, aggressive family court lawyer to sue me for massive amounts of monthly child support. He promised Chloe they could still live a rich, luxurious life off my hard-earned money. Chloe looked down at him with absolute unmasked disgust. She violently yanked her jacket out of his desperate grip, taking a step back, as if his sudden poverty was a contagious disease. She let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed cruelly through the empty foyer. "You are completely delusional, Jamal," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom. "I signed up for a millionaire. I signed up for private jets, expensive shopping sprees, and luxury vacations. I did not sign up for a broke, pathetic loser with a bratty kid who ruins my shoes and cries all night long." She looked around the massive house, shaking her head in sheer contempt. "You do not even own this house anymore," she yelled, pointing at the expensive crystal chandelier above them. "Your ex-wife owns it. Your ex-wife owns your business. She owns your entire life. You are a complete fraud, and I am not spending another second in this miserable place." Outside, a sleek black car pulled into the driveway and honked its horn loudly. Chloe grabbed the handles of her 2 heaviest suitcases. She did not look back at Jamal. She dragged her bags out the front door, the heavy wheels bumping aggressively over the threshold. She climbed into the back seat of the car, slammed the door shut, and drove away, leaving Jamal completely abandoned in the echoing silence of his ruined reality. Jamal slowly picked himself up off the hardwood floor. His breathing became incredibly shallow, his chest tight with a rising, suffocating panic. He walked like a zombie down the hallway and stepped into his dark, quiet home office. He slumped heavily into his expensive leather chair and stared blankly across the mahogany desk. He looked directly at the sleek digital clock sitting perfectly on the edge of the wood, completely unaware that the high-definition lens hidden behind the glass was still silently recording his total psychological collapse. Sitting in the agonizing silence, the thick fog of his blinding arrogance finally began to lift. It was replaced by a crushing, terrifying clarity. The puzzle pieces of the last week violently snapped into place inside his mind. He replayed the day in the lawyer's office. He remembered how easily I had surrendered the massive house and the profitable business. He remembered how eagerly I had offered to take his disabled mother off his hands for a miserable $5,000 check. He remembered the exact timing of Mr. Sterling arriving at his party, right when his ego was inflated to its absolute maximum capacity. Jamal finally understood the horrifying truth. I had never surrendered to him. I had masterfully orchestrated his entire downfall from the very beginning. I had handed him just enough rope to hang himself in front of the entire city. I had used his own blinding greed, his deep vanity, and his toxic cruelty as the exact weapons to destroy him. He realized that I had strategically bought his debt, secured the $20 million property, and isolated him from his entire social circle with terrifying surgical precision. He was completely trapped in a web of my design, and he had no one to blame but himself. But even in the face of total undeniable defeat, Jamal's deeply toxic nature refused to completely surrender. His survival instinct kicked in, fueled by a dark, vindictive need to inflict pain on me. He fixated entirely on the one remaining asset he believed he still controlled: his daughter. He knew that dragging me into a brutal, highly publicized family court battle over Zuri's custody was his absolute last chance to extract money from my new empire. He needed a vicious lawyer to file the paperwork immediately. But ruthless lawyers required massive cash retainers up front, and Jamal did not have a single dollar to his name. Sweating desperate and backed entirely into a corner, he pulled his smartphone out of his pocket. He scrolled past the block numbers of his former friends and stopped at the only people he believed still owed him blind loyalty. He took a deep breath and dialed the number for his sister Tasha and her loudmouth husband Darnell. The phone rang endlessly, the monotonous tone echoing in Jamal's quiet, dark office. Tasha did not pick up. Darnell did not pick up. After 5 consecutive attempts, the automated voice told him the voicemail box was full. Jamal threw his phone across the mahogany desk. He knew they were screening his calls. They had witnessed his spectacular public humiliation the night before, and in their deeply superficial world, failure was a highly contagious disease. But Jamal was desperate. He was backed into a corner with absolutely zero options, and his twisted mind was entirely fixated on his last remaining asset. He needed capital to hire a ruthless family court attorney. He needed to formally secure his primary custody of Zuri so he could drag me into court and legally extort tens of thousands of dollars a month in child support from my new $20 million fortune. He could not wait for them to eventually answer his calls. He had to confront them face to face. With his luxury cars repossessed and his credit cards frozen, Jamal was forced to do something he had not done in over a decade. He walked out of his sprawling suburban neighborhood, his expensive leather shoes scuffing against the pavement, and waited at a public transit stop. The humid Atlanta heat beat down on his shoulders, soaking his wrinkled designer shirt in sweat. When the city bus finally arrived, he had to use the loose coin change he scraped from the bottom of his desk drawer just to pay the fare. He sat in the very back row, surrounded by the exact working-class people he had spent his entire adult life mocking on his social media broadcasts. He stared out the scratched window, aggressively rehearsing the desperate business pitch he was about to deliver to his sister. An hour later, Jamal walked up the outdoor stairwell of Tasha's mid-tier apartment complex. It was a decent building, but light years away from the sprawling mansions they both pretended to own. He banged his fist heavily against her front door. He knocked continuously, refusing to leave until he heard the deadbolt slide back. The door cracked open and Darnell peered out. His eyes narrowed instantly. He did not open the door wider to let Jamal inside. He stood firmly in the doorway, his body physically blocking the entrance. "What do you want?" Jamal Darnell asked, his voice entirely devoid of the loud, fake camaraderie he had displayed just 24 hours earlier at the catered party. "I need to speak to my sister," Jamal said, his voice raspy and desperate. "Tell her to come to the door right now. It is an absolute emergency." Tasha appeared behind her husband, pushing the door open a few more inches. She was not wearing her cheap designer knockoffs today. She wore a simple robe, her face stripped of makeup, revealing the cold, calculating expression she had inherited from their toxic father. She looked at her older brother, taking in his wrinkled clothes, his sweat-stained collar, and his panicked, bloodshot eyes. She did not offer him a warm greeting. She did not ask if he was okay. She simply crossed her arms over her chest and stared at him like he was a complete stranger begging for spare change. "Tasha, you have to help me," Jamal pleaded, his hands shaking as he gripped the doorframe. "Maya completely blindsided me. She stole the property. She stole the business. But it is not over. I still have the ultimate leverage. I have primary legal custody of Zuri. Maya is worth over $20 million right now. If I retain a top-tier family lawyer by tomorrow morning, I can file an emergency motion for child support. The judge will award me at least $50,000 a month to maintain the child's standard of living. I just need a loan. I need $20,000 in cash today to pay the legal retainer. When the child support checks start rolling in, I will pay you back double. We can all be rich again, I promise you." Jamal waited for his sister's eyes to light up with greed. He expected her to immediately run to her bedroom, unlock her safe, and hand over the emergency cash she hoarded. Instead, Tasha just stared at him with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. She let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut Jamal deeper than any knife. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she asked, stepping closer to the screen door. "You want me to give you $20,000? I do not have $20,000, Jamal. Everything Darnell and I have is tied up in credit card debt. Debt that we took on trying to keep up with your fake, pathetic lifestyle." Jamal's face fell. "But you are family," he begged, his voice cracking. "You are my own flesh and blood. You have to stand by me." "Family." Tasha spat the word out like it was poison. "Do not stand on my porch and preach to me about family. You lost the $800,000 house, you lost the luxury car fleet, and you handed a $20 million real estate empire directly to the woman you spent 8 years treating like absolute garbage. You are not a businessman, Jamal. You are a massive walking liability." Darnell nodded in agreement, puffing out his chest. "You heard her, man. You are toxic right now. Maya is a billionaire in the making, and she has elite private security. We are not getting caught in the crossfire of your messy divorce. You need to get off our property before I call the building manager and have you formally trespassed." Jamal stared at his younger sister, the golden child he had always protected and funded. "You are turning your back on me?" he asked, a tear of genuine shock escaping his eye. "After everything I bought for you, after every dinner I paid for, you paid for those things so you could feel superior," Tasha replied coldly. "You bought our loyalty when it was convenient for your ego. But your money is completely gone now. And without your money, Jamal, you are absolutely nothing. Do not ever come to this apartment again." Tasha stepped back and slammed the heavy door directly in his face. The loud click of the deadbolt locking echoed sharply in the humid afternoon air. Jamal stood completely frozen on the concrete walkway. The reality of her vicious words sank into his skin like freezing water. He slowly turned around and walked back down the stairs, his mind entirely blank. During the long, agonizing bus ride back to the suburbs, the absolute darkest realization of Jamal's entire life finally washed over him. He sat in the back of the rattling transit bus, staring at his empty hands. His sister had just ruthlessly discarded him, the exact same way he had discarded me. He finally understood the deeply poisonous nature of his own family. They were raised to view love as a strict financial transaction. Their affection was entirely conditional, based purely on status appearances and the material items they could extract from one another. Tasha did not love him. Darnell did not love him. His fraternity brothers did not love him. Chloe did not love him. They only loved what his credit limit could provide for them. As the bus bounced over the uneven pavement, a suffocating wave of profound regret crushed Jamal's chest. He thought about the woman he had wheeled into the lawyer's office just a few days ago. He thought about Ms. Evelyn. He remembered being a little boy, scraping his knee on the sidewalk, and his mother gently bandaging his leg while baking peach cobbler in their tiny, cramped kitchen. He remembered how she worked double shifts at the hospital just to buy him his first tailored suit for his high school graduation. She had never asked him for a massive house or a luxury car. She only ever asked for his time and his basic respect. Ms. Evelyn was the only human being on the entire planet who had ever loved Jamal unconditionally. Her love was not based on his bank account, his job title, or his social media following. She loved him simply because he was her son. And what had he done in return? He had stolen her meager social security checks to buy cheap jewelry for an influencer who abandoned him at the first sign of trouble. He had publicly degraded her. He had called her a financial burden. He had literally sold the only source of pure, unconditional love in his miserable life to his ex-wife for a $5,000 check. A check that was currently ruined, soaked in cheap champagne on his ruined living room floor. He had traded absolute loyalty for a worthless illusion. He was completely, undeniably alone in the world entirely by his own design. The sun was beginning to set by the time Jamal finally walked up his long driveway. The sprawling suburban house was completely dark. The power company, noticing the severe default on his commercial accounts, had remotely deactivated the electricity grid to the property. The massive structure looked like a hollow, terrifying shell. Jamal unlocked the front door and stepped into the heavy, suffocating heat of the UN air-conditioned foyer. The silence in the house was absolutely deafening. He walked slowly through the dark living room, his expensive shoes crunching over the dried plaster dust and shattered glass from the previous night's physical altercation. He was so consumed by his own monumental grief and self-pity that he had completely forgotten about the events of the previous evening. He had forgotten about the screaming match. He had forgotten about Chloe packing her bags. And most horrifyingly, he had forgotten about his 8-year-old daughter. Jamal collapsed heavily onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to close his eyes and wake up from this endless nightmare. But as he sat in the suffocating darkness, a sound drifted through the quiet house. It was faint at first, echoing from the hallway near the kitchen. Jamal lifted his head, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a harsh, wet, rattling sound. It was the sound of a child coughing. Jamal stood up, his legs shaking, and walked slowly toward the sound. The coughing grew louder and more violent as he approached the kitchen. It was coming directly from behind the heavy wooden door of the walk-in pantry. The exact door Chloe had slammed shut and deadbolted the night before. Jamal's blood ran completely cold. He reached out with trembling fingers and flipped the heavy metal lock. He pulled the pantry door open, the hinges creaking loudly in the dark house. Zuri was lying on the cold tile floor, curled tightly into a small ball. She was clutching her stuffed bear, shivering violently despite the oppressive summer heat trapped inside the house. Her breathing was incredibly shallow, interrupted by deep, painful hacking coughs that shook her entire tiny frame. Jamal dropped to his knees and reached out to touch her forehead. Her skin was burning hot, radiating a terrifying, unnatural heat. She had a massive, dangerous fever. "Daddy," Zuri whispered, her voice incredibly weak and hoarse. "My chest hurts." Jamal scooped his daughter up into his arms, feeling the terrifying fragility of her small body. Panic, pure and unadulterated, finally shattered his selfish haze. He needed to call an ambulance. He needed to drive her to the emergency room. But his cars were gone. His phone battery was completely dead. His credit cards were frozen, and his health insurance had lapsed months ago. He was trapped in the dark with a severely sick child, entirely stripped of the resources he needed to save her. Jamal carried Zuri into the living room, laying her gently on the sofa. He ran to the kitchen, frantically turning the faucet, but even the municipal water supply had been shut off due to non-payment. He had absolutely nothing to give her. No medicine, no cool water, no transportation, and no money. He fell to his knees beside the sofa, gripping his hair in absolute despair. The reality of his complete failure as a father, a son, and a man crashed down upon him. He had spent his entire life obsessing over his public image, completely neglecting the fundamental responsibilities of providing actual care and protection for his family. And now his innocent daughter was paying the ultimate terrifying price for his overwhelming arrogance. He was entirely out of options. There was only one person left in the entire world with the power and the resources to save Zuri. He knew exactly what he had to do, even though it meant swallowing the very last shred of his shattered pride. Jamal carefully wrapped Zuri in the thickest blanket he could find in the dark, sweltering house. Her small body was trembling violently, her teeth chattering despite the oppressive heat radiating from her skin. He scooped her up, his muscles aching from the sheer panic coursing through his veins, and sprinted out the front door. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind him, locking him out of the empty fortress of his own making. He stood on his manicured lawn, staring at the empty driveway where his luxury vehicles used to sit. He had no car. His phone battery was flashing a critical red warning. He had absolutely no money to summon another rideshare. He looked wildly up and down the quiet suburban street. The streetlights cast long, mocking shadows. Desperation completely overrode his massive ego. He ran across the pristine lawns, his expensive leather shoes, slipping on the damp grass directly toward the house of his next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson. Just yesterday morning, Jamal had stood on his driveway and loudly mocked Mr. Henderson on his live broadcast, laughing at the older man for driving a 10-year-old sedan and working a blue-collar job. Now Jamal was violently pounding his fists against Mr. Henderson's front door, tears of sheer terror streaming down his face. When the door opened, Mr. Henderson looked at Jamal with a mixture of shock and deep suspicion. Jamal did not try to act tough. He did not try to spin a lie. He held out his burning, shivering daughter and begged the man for a ride to the emergency room. He completely humiliated himself, sobbing on the front porch of a man he had viciously belittled. Mr. Henderson did not say a single word of reproach. He took one look at Zuri, grabbed his car keys, and pointed to his driveway. The ride to the hospital was agonizingly silent. Jamal sat in the back seat of the old sedan, rocking Zuri back and forth, praying to a god he had only ever used for social status. The automatic sliding doors of the emergency room opened, hitting Jamal with a blast of freezing, sterile air. The waiting room was a chaotic sea of misery. Fluorescent lights buzzed harshly overhead, illuminating rows of hard plastic chairs filled with sick, exhausted people. The smell of strong bleach and stale coffee made his stomach churn. Jamal rushed straight to the triage desk, bypassing the long line of waiting patients. He practically slammed his daughter onto the examination table, shouting for a doctor. The triage nurse was a seasoned professional who did not tolerate entitlement. She calmly took Zuri's vitals, her expression tightening when she read the incredibly high temperature on the thermometer. She immediately flagged Zuri for urgent care, instructing a massive orderly to carry the shivering child into a back examination room. Jamal tried to follow them, desperate to stay by his daughter's side, but a strict administrative clerk stepped directly into his path, holding a heavy clipboard. "Sir, you need to complete the registration and verify your insurance coverage before you can proceed to the treatment area," the clerk said, her voice entirely devoid of emotion. She pointed to a small cubicle enclosed by thick safety glass. Jamal frantically dug through his wallet, his hands shaking violently as he pulled out his premium health insurance card. He slapped the plastic card down on the counter. "Do whatever you have to do," he snapped, a brief flash of his old arrogance returning. "I have top-tier coverage. Just get my daughter a private room and the best pediatric specialist in this entire building." The clerk slid the card through her keyboard reader. She typed for a few agonizing seconds, her eyes scanning the bright computer monitor. She stopped typing, frowned, and ran the card a second time. She looked up at Jamal, sliding the plastic card back under the glass partition. "I am sorry, sir, but this policy is inactive," she stated plainly. "The system shows your coverage was officially terminated exactly 2 months ago due to severe non-payment of your monthly premiums." Jamal froze. The harsh fluorescent lights seemed to blind him. "Terminated," he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "That is impossible. Check it again." I pay for the best family plan in the state. The clerk turned her monitor so he could see the glaring red letters flashing across the screen. You missed 3 consecutive billing cycles, Mr. Davis, she explained coldly. Your insurance provider sent multiple warning notices to your registered address. You currently have absolutely zero health coverage for yourself or your dependent. A sickening wave of nausea crashed over Jamal. His mind raced back exactly 2 months ago. He remembered receiving the urgent billing notices in the mail. He also remembered Chloe standing in his kitchen, whining relentlessly about a vintage diamond tennis bracelet she absolutely needed to wear to a trendy rooftop party. Instead of writing the check to secure his daughter's health and safety, Jamal had chosen to fund his girlfriend's insatiable vanity. He had literally traded his 8-year-old child's medical lifeline for a piece of shiny jewelry that Chloe had already packed away in her suitcase when she abandoned him. Because you do not have active insurance, the hospital policy requires an upfront deposit to admit her for an overnight stay in a private pediatric room and administer intravenous antibiotics. The clerk continued pulling a credit card terminal onto the counter. The required deposit is $4,500. We accept all major credit cards. Jamal swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. $4,500. Just a few days ago, he would have swiped his card without even looking at the receipt. Now that number felt like an impossible mountain. He pulled his gold business credit card from his wallet and inserted the chip into the machine. He held his breath, staring at the small digital screen. Processing. Please wait. Declined. Jamal's heart dropped into his stomach. He quickly pulled the card out and handed the clerk his personal platinum card. Try this one, he said, his voice cracking with desperation. Sometimes the business account flags large medical purchases. The clerk sighed, swiped the second card, and waited. Declined. He tried a third card, a fourth. Every single piece of plastic in his expensive leather wallet was met with the exact same harsh, unforgiving red text. The financial execution I had orchestrated was completely flawless. He had absolutely zero access to any funds. The clerk looked at him with a mixture of pity and annoyance. Sir, if you cannot provide the deposit, we will still stabilize the child's fever in the general emergency ward, but she will not be admitted to a private room, and you will be billed directly for all emergency services. Please step aside so I can help the next patient. Jamal stumbled away from the registration desk, feeling like he was walking underwater. He retreated to a dark corner of the crowded waiting room, sinking heavily into a hard plastic chair. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The battery indicator flashed a critical 2%. He was completely out of time. He quickly opened his contacts and dialed the number of his closest fraternity brother, the man who had loudly toasted to Jamal's imaginary $20 million fortune just last night. The line rang 4 times and went straight to a generic voicemail. Jamal dialed the next brother, then the next. He called the senior pastor of his church. He even called the arrogant men who used to rent his luxury cars. Every single call was ignored. The wealthy, well-connected men he had spent his entire adult life trying to impress had entirely erased him from their lives. They had watched his empire crumble, and they had collectively decided he was no longer worth their time. He was completely socially isolated, financially ruined, and terrifyingly alone. He sat in the loud, chaotic waiting room surrounded by strangers and completely broke down. Jamal Davis, the man who had proudly broadcasted his immense wealth to the entire city of Atlanta, buried his face in his trembling hands and wept uncontrollably. He cried for his lost business. He cried for his repossessed cars. But most of all, he cried because he finally realized what an absolute monster he had become. His massive, blinding ego had completely blinded him to what truly mattered. He had allowed his innocent daughter to be abused, neglected, and locked in a dark room by a woman who did not care if they lived or died. He had failed as a father in the most spectacular, unforgivable way possible. Through the swinging double doors of the treatment area, he heard the faint, painful sound of Zuri crying out for him. The sound ripped through his chest, destroying the very last shred of his toxic pride. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, his eyes burning with exhausted tears. He looked down at his phone. 1% battery remaining. He had exhausted every single option. He had begged his family, he had called his fake friends, and he had tried his worthless credit cards. There was only one person left in the entire world who had the power, the money, and the ruthless efficiency to save his daughter. It was the exact same woman he had spent the last 8 years trying to destroy. With shaking fingers, Jamal opened his encrypted contacts. He stared at my name on the glowing screen. Swallowing his pride felt like swallowing broken glass, but he pressed the green call button and lifted the phone to his ear. He closed his eyes, preparing to beg, preparing to surrender completely to my mercy. The phone did not even ring twice. "I am already here." My voice echoed clearly through the small speaker. The line immediately clicked dead. Jamal's phone screen faded to black, the battery finally dying completely. He sat frozen in the hard plastic chair, my calm, chilling words echoing in his mind. He slowly lowered the dead phone from his ear and opened his eyes. He turned his head toward the massive glass entrance of the emergency room. The automatic sliding doors parted with a soft mechanical hiss. The chaotic noise of the waiting room seemed to completely vanish as I walked through the entrance. I was no longer wearing the glamorous emerald gown from the party. I was dressed in a sharp, tailored black business suit, looking like a ruthless corporate assassin. My face was a mask of cold, unyielding determination. I did not look like a grieving mother or a panicked ex-wife. I looked like a woman who had come to collect a massive debt. Flanking me on either side were 3 people who made Jamal's blood run completely cold. To my right was Leon, my towering private security guard, his eyes constantly scanning the room for threats. To my left was the senior partner of the most aggressive, expensive family law firm in Atlanta, carrying a thick leather briefcase. And right behind me, wearing a perfectly pressed uniform, was a senior officer from the city police department, his hand resting casually near his duty belt. Jamal stared at me, his mouth completely dry. He realized in that exact second that he had not just called me for financial help. He had summoned his own executioner. I did not even look at him. I walked straight past his trembling body, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hospital floor, and directed my medical team to immediately take over Zuri's care. The hospital administrator, who had previously denied Jamal's service, practically tripped over herself to assist my senior attorney. Within a matter of minutes, the massive financial deposit was cleared. Zuri was gently moved from the chaotic emergency room into a premium private pediatric suite. She was hooked up to intravenous fluids, given the strongest antibiotics available, and surrounded by the absolute best pediatric specialists in the entire city of Atlanta. I stood by her bedside holding her small, burning hand until her breathing finally steadied and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep under the watchful eye of Ms. Evelyn. Once I knew my daughter was completely safe and protected, my lawyer walked back out to the waiting room. Jamal was still sitting in the hard plastic chair holding his dead smartphone. My lawyer handed the police officer the emergency court orders we had drafted on the way over. Jamal was not arrested that night, but the officer formally served him with a mandatory court summons. He was ordered to appear in family court at 8 o'clock the very next morning to answer for his severe negligence. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Fulton County Family Court were a stark, depressing contrast to the luxurious environments Jamal was used to. The courtroom was heavily paneled in dark wood, smelling of old paper and nervous sweat. I sat perfectly composed at the petitioner table. I wore a tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek bun, flanked by 3 of the most expensive, aggressive family law attorneys in the state. Across the wide aisle, Jamal sat at the respondent table. He looked completely destroyed. He wore the exact same wrinkled, sweat-stained suit he had worn to the hospital the night before. He had not slept a single wink. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, and he kept nervously bouncing his leg up and down under the table. Because all of his bank accounts and credit cards were entirely frozen by my logistics company, he could not afford to hire a private attorney. Next to him sat a severely overworked, exhausted public defender, holding a thin manila folder containing the bare minimum details of the case. The judge, a stern, incredibly sharp woman with decades of experience dealing with deadbeat parents, walked into the room and immediately called the emergency hearing to order. Jamal wasted absolutely no time. Before his public defender could even introduce himself, Jamal launched directly into his heavily rehearsed victim routine. He tried to turn on his old manipulative Southern charm, adopting a tone of deep fabricated sorrow. He stood up and swore under oath that he was a devoted, loving single father who had been completely blindsided by a vicious, jealous ex-wife. He looked directly at the judge and claimed that I had maliciously abandoned my only child in a petty fit of rage. He told the court that I had walked out on our marriage, leaving him to pick up the pieces and care for Zuri all by himself. He painted a ridiculous, entirely fictional picture of his fatherly devotion. He swore that the absolute second his daughter showed signs of a fever, he had sacrificed everything to rush her to the hospital. He conveniently left out the fact that his luxury cars were repossessed, his house was dark, and he lacked the basic funds or active health insurance to actually get her treated. He played the martyr flawlessly, presenting himself as the tragic victim of a ruthless financial takeover orchestrated by a bitter woman. Then the extortion attempt began. The public defender stood up, cleared his throat, and made his aggressive pitch to the judge. He argued that according to the initial temporary separation agreement Jamal and I had signed in the lawyer's office just days ago, Jamal held primary physical custody of the child. Therefore, the public defender argued I was legally obligated to maintain Zuri's standard of living regardless of Jamal's current financial disaster. The lawyer pointed a finger directly at me. He listed my newly acquired $20 million real estate portfolio and the massive profits generated by my medical logistics company. He shamelessly demanded that the court order me to pay Jamal a staggering $50,000 a month in emergency child support. The lawyer claimed the money was necessary to secure a safe home, hire private security, and pay for Zuri's future education. But everyone in the room knew exactly what that money was really for. It was Jamal's desperate attempt to fund his lost, lavish lifestyle. Even in his completely ruined, pathetic state, a brief, sickening flicker of arrogant hope returned to Jamal's eyes. He sat up a little straighter. He actually believed this demand was his golden ticket out of the poverty he had created for himself. My lead attorney stood up slowly from our table. He meticulously buttoned his suit jacket. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice in anger. He possessed the quiet, terrifying calm of a man holding all the winning cards. He looked at the judge and calmly informed the court that my client had absolutely zero intention of paying Mr. Davis a single dime in child support. Furthermore, my attorney stated we were seeking immediate, full, and permanent legal and physical custody of the minor child. And beyond that, we were filing a formal motion for the absolute termination of Mr. Davis's parental rights due to severe criminal neglect and direct child endangerment. Jamal scoffed loudly, shaking his head in mock disbelief. He leaned over and whispered something to his public defender. The public defender immediately objected, throwing his hands up in the air. He claimed we had absolutely no physical proof of such outrageous, damaging allegations. He accused my legal team of trying to smear a loving father's reputation to avoid paying the $50,000 monthly support. My lawyer simply smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile. He turned and motioned to the court bailiff. The bailiff walked to the corner of the room and rolled a large, high-definition television monitor directly into the center of the courtroom, positioning it so the judge, the public defender, and Jamal had a perfect, unobstructed view. My attorney handed a secure, encrypted flash drive to the court clerk. He clearly explained for the official record that a hidden nanny camera completely legally purchased and placed inside the marital home prior to my departure had captured the exact events of the previous evening. The judge leaned forward in her high leather chair, her expression instantly hardening into stone. The clerk plugged the drive into the system and pressed play. The courtroom was immediately filled with the crystal-clear 4K audio of Chloe screaming at my daughter. The massive screen illuminated the dark living room of Jamal's house. The judge watched in absolute stunned horror as Chloe violently grabbed Zuri by her small arm. The high-definition lens captured the exact moment Chloe's sharp acrylic nails dug deeply into Zuri's skin. The agonizing sound of Zuri crying out for her father echoed terribly off the heavy wood-paneled walls of the courtroom. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands hovering frozen over her keyboard. The public defender slowly lowered his pen, staring at the screen with his mouth slightly open. Then the camera angle shifted just enough to clearly show Jamal. The man who had just sworn under oath that he was a devoted, protective father was sitting comfortably on his expensive sofa. He was drinking warm champagne straight from the bottle. He was completely ignoring his daughter's terrified, desperate screams. He did not move a single muscle to help her. The video continued to play mercilessly. It showed Chloe dragging a crying barefoot Zuri down the hallway. It showed Chloe shoving my daughter violently into the cramped, pitch-black space of the walk-in pantry. And then came the final damning piece of evidence. The incredibly loud metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot in the perfectly quiet courtroom. The video faded to black, leaving the courtroom in a thick, suffocating silence. The judge was visibly furious. Her face had turned a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. She gripped her wooden gavel so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. She slammed the gavel down on her desk with an explosive crack that made Jamal physically jump in his seat. She ordered the clerk to turn the monitor off immediately. She leaned over her high bench and glared down at Jamal with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that could have melted steel. Jamal was shaking violently. His arrogant facade was completely, permanently shattered. He looked frantically at the blank television screen, then at the furious judge, and finally at his public defender. But his lawyer had completely pushed his chair away from Jamal, refusing to even look at him. Defending a client was one thing, but defending a man caught on crystal-clear video allowing his child to be tortured was career suicide. Jamal opened his mouth to make another pathetic excuse to try and blame Chloe, to try and twist the narrative one last time, but absolutely no words came out. His throat was completely paralyzed by fear. I stood up slowly from my chair. I smoothed the front of my tailored suit jacket and looked down at the broken, miserable man who had spent 8 years trying to convince me I was worthless. I made sure my voice was crystal clear, perfectly pitched, so the court reporter could transcribe every single syllable and entirely devoid of any human pity. "You thought I abandoned my daughter?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. I let the question hang in the air for a fraction of a second, watching the absolute terror completely consume Jamal's eyes. "I left her there just long enough for you to prove to the state of Georgia that you are unfit to be a father." The judge did not give Jamal a single second to respond to my statement. She leaned over her elevated bench, her eyes flashing with righteous fury. "Mr. Davis," she began, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "What I just witnessed on that screen is a textbook definition of severe child endangerment, criminal neglect, and abuse. You willfully allowed an innocent 8-year-old girl to be assaulted and locked in a dark room while you sat mere feet away consuming alcohol." She pointed her wooden gavel directly at his face. "I am fully prepared to instruct the bailiff to take you into custody right this very second. I will personally call the district attorney to press felony criminal charges against both you and your girlfriend. You will go to state prison, Mr. Davis." Jamal physically recoiled as if he had been struck. He began to hyperventilate again, his chest heaving as panic completely consumed his mind. He looked wildly at his public defender, begging silently for help. But the exhausted lawyer simply shook his head and closed his thin manila folder. Jamal was completely cornered. He had no money for bail, no lawyer to fight for his freedom, and undeniable high-definition video evidence stacked entirely against him. That is when my lead attorney smoothly intervened. He pulled a crisp white legal document from his leather briefcase and placed it gently on the respondent table, right in front of Jamal's shaking hands. "Your Honor," my attorney said calmly, My client has authorized me to offer a single, entirely non-negotiable alternative. If Mr. Davis signs this document right now, permanently relinquishing all parental rights to the minor child Zuri, granting my client sole legal and physical custody forever, we will agree not to pursue the criminal child endangerment charges against him. Jamal stared blankly at the white paper. It was his ultimate defeat printed in stark black ink. He looked up at me, tears of sheer panic and profound loss streaming heavily down his face. "Maya, please." He choked out, his voice cracking pitifully in the quiet room. "Do not take my daughter away from me. She is the absolute only family I have left in this world." I looked down at him with absolutely zero sympathy. "You lost the right to call her your family the exact second you let another woman lock her in the dark," I replied coldly. "Sign the paper, Jamal, or I will gladly watch them put you in handcuffs and drag you away." The public defender leaned over and whispered firmly in Jamal's ear, explicitly telling him that this was the absolute best deal he was ever going to get, and that he needed to sign it immediately to avoid a devastating felony conviction. Jamal's hands shook violently as he picked up the cheap plastic pen from the table. He sobbed openly in the silent courtroom, the sound pathetic and completely hollow. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name, completely signing away his rights, his leverage, and his very last connection to a family that truly loved him. The judge aggressively snatched the signed document from the clerk, stamped it with a heavy final thud, and looked down at Jamal with absolute disgust. "Your parental rights are officially terminated," she declared sharply. "Get out of my courtroom, Mr. Davis." Jamal stood up slowly. He looked like a hollow, entirely broken shell of a man. He walked down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden doors. He left the courthouse and stepped out onto the busy Atlanta street. The humid morning air had suddenly turned cold, and the sky opened up, unleashing a torrential, freezing downpour. Jamal did not have an umbrella. He did not have a luxury car waiting for him. He walked slowly toward a rusted city bus stop, the heavy rain soaking his wrinkled suit to the bone. He stood shivering under the small metal overhang. He had absolutely no wife, no mistress, no child, no mother, no business, and no home. He was a man who had arrogantly demanded the entire world, and was left with literally nothing. 3 months later, the dark and stormy memory of that courtroom was entirely washed away by the bright golden sunlight streaming through the massive windows of my newly purchased Buckhead estate. It was a proper Sunday dinner, the kind that deeply honored our rich cultural roots and celebrated our incredible hard-won victory. The sprawling mahogany dining table was covered in a breathtaking feast of authentic homemade soul food. The rich, mouth-watering aroma of baked macaroni and cheese, slow-cooked collard greens, with smoked turkey, crispy fried chicken, candied yams, and warm buttermilk cornbread filled the massive room. The atmosphere was incredibly vibrant, filled with genuine joy and unbreakable family warmth. Zuri was running around the sunlit room, her infectious laughter echoing brightly off the high ceilings. She was completely healthy, her temporary trauma entirely erased by the overwhelming love, safety, and security of her new environment. She wore a beautiful bright yellow dress, playing happily with a new set of building blocks. She was a brilliant, thriving child who finally had the peaceful, loving home she truly deserved. Sitting at the very head of the grand dining table was the true, undisputed matriarch of our family, Ms. Evelyn. She looked absolutely spectacular. She was wearing a stunning, custom-tailored royal blue dress that perfectly complemented her glowing, healthy skin. I had hired the absolute best private physical therapists in the state, and she was already regaining significant strength in her legs. But more importantly, her spirit was completely healed. Her dignity was entirely restored. She was no longer a discarded burden hidden away in a back bedroom. She was the highly respected queen of our household, surrounded entirely by people who cherished her deeply and unconditionally. I walked over to the table holding a large crystal pitcher dripping with cold condensation. I smiled warmly and poured a tall glass of ice-cold sweet tea, placing it gently next to Evelyn's plate. I picked up my own glass and raised it high into the air, looking at the beautiful, peaceful life we had successfully built from the dark ashes of Jamal's total destruction. Evelyn reached out and gently clinked her glass against mine. She looked at me, her eyes shining with profound wisdom and unconditional love. "Family is not about whose blood you share," she said softly, her voice carrying a deep, unshakable truth. "It is about who stays to help you clean up the mess." I smiled, taking a long, refreshing sip of my sweet tea. I looked at Zuri, then back to Evelyn, knowing that no matter what challenges came our way, we would never be broken again. Fade to black. The most powerful lesson from this story is that true family is defined by unconditional love and respect, not by blood or financial status. Jamal was completely blinded by his own arrogance and greed, throwing away the genuine loyalty of his mother and wife for a superficial illusion. He severely underestimated the quiet strength of the woman he mistreated, proving that true power does not need to boast. Ultimately, the story teaches us that treating people as disposable burdens will leave you entirely alone. We must value the people who stand by us during our hardest moments, because character and loyalty are the only currencies that truly last. If you have ever had to rebuild your life and protect your peace after someone underestimated your worth, please leave a comment below and hit that subscribe button for more empowering stories.